They say the cruelest words come from the people who are supposed to love you most. For 35 years, I was the invisible daughter, the one who sacrificed everything, the one who was never quite enough. At Christmas dinner, my mother looked me in the eye and said, "You'll never be as successful as your brother. He has everything you don't." I smiled. I stayed silent, because 2 years earlier, I'd made a decision. A quiet one. The kind nobody notices, until it's too late. Then my niece gasped at her phone. "Oh my God! Aunt's on the Forbes Billionaire List." The room froze. My mother's fork clattered to the floor. What happened next wasn't just revenge, it was justice. This is the story of how I went from the family disappointment to the woman they couldn't ignore, how I built an empire while they thought I was failing, how silence became my greatest weapon. Stick with me until the end, because the truth, it's so much sweeter than you think. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Amanda Lopez. I am 35 years old, and until recently I worked in middle management at a tech company where my older brother happened to be vice president. For as long as I can remember, I've been the daughter who tried too hard, loved too much, and somehow always fell short. But that Christmas dinner, that was the night everything changed. The Lopez family Christmas gathering was always held at my mother's house in the suburbs. The dining room glowed with warm candlelight, the smell of roasted turkey filling every corner, and relatives packed around the table laughing and chatting. It looked perfect from the outside. It always did. My brother Peter arrived late as usual, making a grand entrance with shopping bags from Tiffany's. He was 40 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, even for a family dinner every inch the successful executive. He pulled out a small blue box and handed it to our mother with a confident smile. "Merry Christmas, Mum," he said. She opened and let it with trembling fingers, and when she saw the diamond bracelet inside, her white eyes filled with tears. "Peter, this is too much," she whispered, but she was already clasping it around her wrist, holding it up to catch the light. "It's beautiful. You're so thoughtful, mijo." She stood up and hugged him tightly, holding on for what felt like minutes, while everyone at the table murmured their admiration. Uncle Carlos whistled. Aunt Teresa said something about how lucky Mum was to have such a generous son. I waited until the fuss died down, then reached into my bag and pulled out my gift. It was wrapped in simple brown paper with a red ribbon I'd tied myself. Inside was a scarf I'd hand-knitted over the past 6 weeks, staying up late after work, choosing colours I knew she loved, soft cream and dusty rose. "Merry Christmas, Mum," I said, handing it to her. She took it, unwrapped it carefully and held up the scarf. "Oh, that's nice, Amanda. Thank you." She folded it and set it on the sideboard behind her next to the serving dishes. Just like that. No tears, no hug. She turned back to admire her bracelet again, and I felt something twist in my chest. Dinner started, and the conversation naturally gravitated toward Peter's accomplishments. He'd just been promoted to vice president, the youngest in the company's history. Everyone wanted to hear about it. He told the story with practiced ease, humble bragging about the challenges, the late nights, the strategic decisions that had impressed the board. Then my mother, beaming with pride, looked down the table at me. "Peter just made VP at 40, she announced to everyone as if they hadn't all been listening. "And, Amanda, well, at least you're trying, sweetheart." The table went quiet for just a second. I felt every eye shift toward me. My mother continued, turning to Aunt Teresa with a pitying smile that made my stomach drop. "You'll never be as successful as your brother, Amanda. Some people are just born different. Peter has the drive, the intelligence. He's always been special." I heard a few uncomfortable laughs. Someone tried to change the subject, but the words hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Peter, hoping for something, anything, a word of support, a deflection, but he just smirked into his wine glass and said nothing. My hands were under the table, gripping my napkin so hard my knuckles turned white. I forced my face into a smile, nodded as if I agreed, and took a sip of water. But inside, something fundamental shifted. For 35 years, I'd been trying to earn a place in this family. In that moment, I realized the truth: there was no room for me here. There never had been. That night, as everyone laughed around the table, something inside me went quiet. Not broken, quiet. Like a storm learning to wait, I sat there at that table, fork in hand, nodding at the right moments, laughing when everyone else laughed. But inside, I wasn't there anymore. I was 15 years old again, then 20, then 25, watching the same patterns repeat over and over, like a song I'd memorized without realizing it. The weight of years doesn't hit you all at once. It accumulates slowly like snow on a roof, until one day you look up and realize the whole structure is about to collapse. It started when I was 20 years old. I can still remember the day the acceptance letter came from Stanford. Full scholarship, pre-med track. I'd worked 4 years of high school for that letter, studied until 2 a.m. most nights, volunteered at the community clinic every weekend. When I opened that envelope and saw the word congratulations, I cried. Not because I was surprised, but because I'd finally done something undeniable. Something even my mother couldn't dismiss. I showed her the letter that afternoon in the kitchen. She was making tamales for Peter, who was home for the weekend from his MBA program across the country. She wiped her hands on her apron, read the letter and smiled. "That's wonderful, Mija. I'm proud of you." For one perfect moment, I felt seen. Then Peter walked in, and everything changed. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eye shoulders, slumped, wearing the same wrinkled shirt he'd had on the day before. He sat down at the kitchen table without a word, and my mother immediately went to him. "What's wrong, mijo? What happened?" He told us he was drowning in debt from his MBA program, over $80,000 borrowed, and he was only halfway through. His part-time job wasn't covering living expenses. He was thinking about dropping out, maybe coming home, trying to find work, and pay down the loans over the next decade. My mother's face went pale. "No," she said firmly. "You can't drop out. You're so close. This degree will change your life." Peter shook his head. "I can't afford it, Mum. I've applied for every grant, every scholarship. There's nothing left." That's when my mother turned to me. She looked at my Stanford letter still in my hand, then back at Peter. I saw something shift in her eyes, some internal calculation I didn't fully understand at the time. "Amanda," she said softly, "Stanford will always be there. You can go next year or the year after. But your brother needs help now." I didn't understand what she was asking at first. She continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You have money saved from your job at the grocery store, don't you? And you could keep working, save more help. Peter finish his program. He's so close, Mija. And when he graduates, he'll get a good job and he'll pay you back. You'll still go to college, just a little later." I looked at Peter. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Good daughters sacrifice," my mother said, putting her hand on my shoulder. "That's what keeps families together. That's what my mother did for her brothers. That's what I would have done if I'd had the chance." I was 20 years old. I didn't know how to say no to her. I didn't even know I was allowed to. So I wrote Peter a check for $12,000, every cent I'd saved from 3 years of working after school and weekends. I called Stanford and deferred my admission. Then I deferred it again. And again. Eventually, the deferral expired, and I never went back. Peter finished his MBA. He got a corporate job. He never paid me back. And when I brought it up once years later, he looked confused. That wasn't alone, Amanda. That was family helping. Family. Don't make it weird. My mother nodded in agreement. I never mentioned it again. I learned something that year. I learned that my dreams were negotiable, but Peter's were sacred. I learned that sacrifice was noble when I did it, but unnecessary when it came to me. And most importantly, I learned that if I was just good enough, patient enough, selfless enough, eventually my turn would come. Eventually, I'd be seen. But my turn never came. The pattern continued. When Peter's first startup failed and he had $30,000 in credit card debt, I co-signed a loan so he could consolidate. When my mother got sick with pneumonia and needed round-the-clock care for 2 weeks, I took unpaid leave from my job while Peter was too busy with a product launch. When Peter's wife left him and he needed a place to stay, I gave up my one-bedroom apartment and moved back home so he could have it. Every time my mother would say the same thing. "You're such a good daughter. This is what family does." But she never said it to Peter. She never asked him to sacrifice. His career was too important, his time too valuable, his path too promising to interrupt. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that once Peter was stable, once he'd made it, things would balance out. He'd remember what I'd done. My mother would see how much I'd given. And then, finally, I'd be valued the way he was valued. 15 years. That's how long I waited. 15 years of working at a company where my little brother became my boss. 15 years of attending family dinners where his accomplishments were celebrated and my presence was simply expected. 15 years of watching my mother's face light up when he entered a room and remain politely neutral when I did. I knew where this came from. My mother had grown up in a small town in Mexico, the youngest of 6 children. In her family, sons were investments and daughters were insurance. The boys went to school while the girls learned to cook. The boys inherited land while the girls inherited recipes. She used to tell me stories about how she'd wanted to open a little dress shop when she was young, how she'd sketched designs in a notebook and saved money from selling embroidered pillowcases at the market. Then, she married my father. He was a good man in many ways, but traditional. When she mentioned the dress shop idea, he'd said, "We don't need the money. I provide for this family. You take care of the home." She'd put the notebook away. I found it once when I was cleaning out the attic years after my father died. The sketches were beautiful. She could have been something. But she'd buried that dream, and somewhere along the way she'd decided that I should bury mine too. Not out of cruelty, out of familiarity. This was just how it worked. This was the way love looked in our family. But sitting at that Christmas table watching her admire Peter's diamond bracelet, while my scarf sat forgotten on the sideboard, I finally understood something I should have seen years ago. I spent 15 years trying to earn love that was never mine to earn. But that Christmas I realised maybe being good isn't enough anymore. 2 weeks after that Christmas dinner, I walked into work on a Monday morning like I had 1,000 times before. The office was the same as always, fluorescent lights, humming overhead, the smell of burnt coffee from the break room keyboards clicking in their steady rhythm. I had no reason to think this day would be different from any other. I'd worked at Peters Incorporated for 8 years. It wasn't the career I dreamed of when I was younger, back when I thought I might become a doctor or maybe a researcher, but it was stable. I managed operations for the customer service division, oversaw a team of 12 people, made sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes, while the executives took credit for our efficiency numbers. I was good at my job, reliable. The kind of employee who came in early, stayed late, never complained. Peter had been at the company for 10 years, working his way up from senior analyst to director, and finally, 2 years ago, to vice president of strategy. We didn't work directly together. Our departments barely overlapped, and that's how I preferred it. At the office, I could almost pretend we were just colleagues, that the complicated weight of our family history didn't exist between 9 and 5. That Monday, I'd barely sat down at my desk when my phone rang. Internal extension, HR. "Amanda, could you come down to conference room B, please? We need to speak with you." My first thought was that someone on my team had filed a complaint, or maybe there was an issue with timesheets. I grabbed my notebook and headed downstairs, running through possible scenarios in my mind. When I opened the conference room door, I saw Jennifer from HR, sitting on one side of the table, her face professionally neutral, and next to her, Peter, my brother. In his perfectly pressed navy suit and silver tie, hands folded on the table in front of him, expression completely unreadable. My stomach dropped. This wasn't about timesheets. "Have a seat, Amanda," Jennifer said, gesturing to the chair across from them. I sat down slowly, setting my notebook on the table. Neither of them smiled. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Jennifer opened a folder and slid a piece of paper across the table toward me. "Amanda, we're going through a restructuring process. As part of that process, we've had to make some difficult decisions about staffing." She paused, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "Your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words didn't make sense at first. I looked down at the paper. Termination of employment, my name at the top, today's date. "What?" I heard myself say. Peter spoke for the first time, his voice flat and businesslike. "We're restructuring the operations division, consolidating departments. Your role is redundant in the new structure." I looked at him, waiting for something more. An apology. An explanation. Any acknowledgement that I was his sister, that this was more than just a corporate transaction. He looked back at me with the same expression he'd use with any employee. Cold, professional, detached. "You knew about this," I said. It wasn't a question. "Of course I knew about it. I'm VP of Strategy. I helped design the restructuring plan." "And you didn't think to warn me, to tell me privately before calling me into an HR meeting?" My voice was rising despite my efforts to control it. Peter sighed, like I was being difficult. "It's business, sis. Don't take it personal." "Don't take it personal. You're firing me." "The company is eliminating your position," he corrected. "There's a difference." Jennifer cleared her throat uncomfortably. "You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay and we'll provide a reference letter. If you have any questions about benefits or final paycheck, you can contact me directly." But I wasn't listening to Jennifer anymore. I was staring at Peter, trying to find some trace of the brother I'd given up Stanford, for the brother I'd co-signed loans, for the brother I'd defended and supported and sacrificed for over and over again. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Just tell me why. Is my work not good enough? Did I do something wrong?" He leaned back in his chair, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Discomfort, maybe, or impatience. "You're not strategic enough for the new direction we're taking. We need people who can think bigger, move faster, take risks. You're competent at execution, but you don't have the vision we need." Not strategic enough. The words landed like physical blows. I'd spent 8 years making his company run smoothly. 8 years solving problems nobody else wanted to deal with. 8 years being the reliable one, while people like Peter got promotions for their vision. "I see," I said, because I didn't trust myself to say anything else. "You'll land on your feet," Peter added, standing up to signal the meeting was over. "You always do. You're good at adapting." He left the conference room without looking back. Jennifer handed me some paperwork about final pay and benefits continuation, explaining things I couldn't focus on. I signed where she told me to sign, nodded when she spoke, and somehow made it back to my desk to pack my things. My team members watched with confused expressions as I loaded my few personal items into a cardboard box, a coffee mug my team had given me for my birthday, a small succulent plant, a framed photo of me and my mother from 5 years ago, back when I still thought her approval was achievable. I left the photo on the desk. I drove home in a daze, the termination letter on the passenger seat beside me. When I got to my apartment, I sat on the couch and stared at my phone for a long time before I finally called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Amanda, is everything okay?" "Peter fired me," I said. The words came out flat, emotionless. There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I went to work this morning and Peter had me called into HR and they eliminated my position. He fired me, Mum. He didn't warn me, didn't tell me it was coming, just had me escorted to a conference room and told me I wasn't strategic enough." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke, her voice was careful. I'm sure he didn't want to do that, Mija. Peter has to make hard decisions. That's what leaders do. It's not personal. Everyone keeps saying that. It's not personal, but it feels pretty personal when your own brother fires you without warning. You're upset right now. I understand, but don't make this difficult for Peter. He's under a lot of pressure. The company is going through changes, and he has to think about what's best for the business, not what's comfortable for family. I sat there on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, waiting for her to ask if I was okay, waiting for her to say she was sorry this happened, waiting for her to offer to talk to Peter, to advocate for me to do anything that might suggest I mattered as much as he did. But she didn't, because in our family, Peter's comfort always came first. Peter's career was always the priority. Peter's decisions were always justified, and my role was always to understand, to adapt, to make it easy for him. I have to go, Mum, I said quietly. Don't do anything rash, Amanda. Just take some time. Calm down, and you'll see this is for the best. I hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there in my apartment for hours, holding that termination letter, reading it over and over. Your position is being eliminated. Not strategic enough. Think bigger. Move faster. And somewhere around hour 3, as the afternoon light faded and my apartment grew dark around me, something shifted. The hurt was still there, raw and burning, but underneath it, something else was growing. Something harder. Something clear. As I stared at the termination letter, a strange calm settled over me. Maybe it's time I stopped being the good sister and started being the smart one. The calm lasted exactly 14 days. I spent those 2 weeks applying for jobs, updating my resume, reaching out to former colleagues who might know of openings. I was methodical about it, treating my job search like a project with clear goals and timelines. Every morning, I'd wake up, make coffee, and spend 8 hours at my laptop, as if I still had somewhere to be. It gave me structure. It kept me from thinking too much about what Peter had done, about what my mother had said about the fact that I was 35 years old and starting over from nothing. My savings account had about $18,000 in it, enough to cover rent and expenses for maybe 4 months if I was careful. After that, I'd need to figure something out. On day 15, I checked my mailbox and found an envelope from First National Bank. I almost threw it away, assuming it was a credit card offer, but something made me open it. Past due notice. Final warning before collections. I stared at the words confused. The letter stated that I had a personal loan of $50,000 that was now 60 days overdue. Monthly payments of $847 had been missed for 2 consecutive months. If I didn't contact them immediately to arrange payment, the account would be sent to collections and reported to credit bureaus. My hands started shaking. I'd never taken out a loan from First National Bank. I'd never taken out any loan except my car payment, which was current, and through a completely different institution. I called the number on the letter. After navigating through automated menus and waiting on hold for 12 minutes, I finally reached a human being. I'm calling about a loan that's apparently in my name, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I never applied for this loan. I think there's been a mistake. The customer service representative asked for my information, and I heard keys clicking. I'm showing a personal loan opened 6 months ago, January 15th. The application was submitted online and approved within 48 hours. Funds were dispersed to the account on file. What account? I never received any money. More clicking. The funds were transferred to a business account registered to Lopez Investment Holdings. My stomach dropped. Lopez Investment Holdings was Peter's side company, the one he'd started 2 years ago to manage his stock portfolio and real estate investments. Can you tell me what address was listed on the application? I asked. She read it back to me. My address? My current apartment. And the social security number. She couldn't give me the full number for security reasons, but she confirmed the last 4 digits. Mine. I hung up and sat very still, trying to process what this meant. 6 months ago, January, Peter had used my social security number to take out a $50,000 loan and deposited the money into his business account. 6 months ago, we were still working at the same company. He was still my brother, who smiled at me in the hallways, who invited me to occasional family dinners, who acted like everything was normal between us. He'd been planning this even then, using me even then, and I'd had no idea. I spent the next 3 hours on the phone with the bank with credit agencies filing fraud reports and requesting documentation. Every person I spoke to said the same thing: I'd need to file a police report for identity theft if I wanted to dispute the loan. Otherwise, I was legally responsible for the full amount plus interest and late fees. By evening, I had copies of the loan application emailed to me. There was my name, my social security number, my address, even a forged signature that looked close enough to mine that I could see how it had passed verification. The IP address showed the application had been submitted from Peters Incorporated's network, from the executive floor, from Peter's office. I should have called the police. I should have filed the report immediately. But instead, I got in my car and drove to my mother's house. She answered the door in her bathrobe, surprised to see me. Amanda. What are you doing here so late? I walked past her into the living room and put the bank documents on her coffee table. Did you know about this? She picked up the papers, squinting without her reading glasses. What is this? It's a loan for $50,000 in my name, except I didn't take it out. Peter did. He used my social security number and forged my signature, and now I'm responsible for a debt I never agreed to. My mother's face went pale. She set the papers down slowly. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, Mum. The loan was deposited directly into his business account. He did this 6 months ago while I was still working at his company before he fired me. He's been planning to use me, steal from me for at least half a year. She was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. Maybe he was going to tell you. Maybe he needed the money urgently and planned to explain later. I stared at her. He committed fraud, Mum. He stole my identity. This is a felony. Don't be dramatic. He's your brother. He wouldn't steal from you. Then what do you call this? I picked up the documents and shook them. What do you call using someone's identity without permission to take out a loan they'll never be able to pay back? My mother stood up, wrapping her bathrobe tighter around herself. He needed it for a family investment, something that would benefit all of us eventually. You weren't using your credit anyway. Why are you being so selfish about this? The word hung in the air between us. Selfish. I'd sacrificed my education for Peter. I'd co-signed his loans. I'd given up apartments, taken unpaid leave, worked at his company for less than I was worth. And now, after he'd committed identity theft and left me holding a $50,000 debt I couldn't pay, my mother was calling me selfish for objecting. Does he know you know? She asked. Not yet. Then don't tell him. Don't make trouble over this. Work it out quietly. The family doesn't need more drama. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and finally saw what I'd been refusing to see for 35 years. She didn't love me less than Peter. She didn't love me at all. What she loved was the idea of a perfect family, a successful son, a daughter who never made waves. She loved the image we presented to relatives and neighbours, and she would sacrifice me over and over again to protect that image. I'm not going to work this out quietly, I said. Her face hardened. If you make trouble for your brother, if you do anything to hurt his reputation or his business, you'll regret it. This family won't forgive you. This family, I said quietly, has never forgiven me for existing in Peter's shadow. So I guess I don't have much to lose. I left her house and drove home in silence. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just drove through the dark street, hands steady on the wheel, mind working through possibilities. Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop and started researching. Identity theft law. credit fraud, federal penalties, maximum sentences. I read case studies and legal precedents until my eyes burned. Around midnight, I texted Daniel Martinez, a friend from college who'd become a lawyer. We'd stayed in touch over the years, occasionally meeting for coffee when he was in town. He was one of the few people I knew who existed completely outside my family's orbit. Need legal advice? Can we meet tomorrow? He responded within minutes. Of course. Everything okay? Not really. I'll explain in person. The next day, I met Daniel at a coffee shop downtown. I showed him everything, the bank documents, the loan application, the forged signature. I explained about Peter, about the firing, about my mother's reaction. Daniel's expression grew darker as I talked. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. This is felony fraud, Amanda. Identity theft wire fraud, because it was done electronically. Possibly more charges depending on how deep this goes. If you file a police report and press charges, your brother could go to jail. Minimum 2 years, possibly up to 15, depending on the prosecutor and his criminal history. I know, I said. So what do you want to do? I thought about it. About Peter sitting across from me in that conference room, telling me I wasn't strategic enough. About my mother calling me selfish for objecting to fraud. About 15 years of being invisible, expendable, useful only as a source of money and sacrifice. I'm not ready to destroy him, I said slowly. Not yet, but I'm not going to be the good sister anymore either. I'm not going to quietly fix this and pretend it didn't happen. Then what? I want to be free. Free from this family, free from their expectations, free from being the person they use and discard. I looked at Daniel. If they took my name and used it for their benefit, maybe it's time I take it back and make it mean something they never imagined. Daniel studied me for a long moment. What are you thinking? I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. That night I sat in my apartment with all the lights off, laptop glowing in the darkness. I didn't file a police report. I didn't confront Peter. I just sat there thinking, planning, letting something new take shape in the quiet spaces of my mind. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were wrong. Silence was just me planning. Planning, I learned, requires patience, and for the first time in my life, I had nothing but time. I spent 3 days in my apartment, barely leaving, except to buy groceries. I ignored my mother's calls. I didn't respond to Peter's single text message, asking if I'd calmed down yet about the jobs situation. I just sat with my laptop researching the thinking, mapping out possibilities that didn't yet have clear shapes. On the 4th day, I got a LinkedIn message from someone I hadn't thought about in 15 years. Sarah Chen. We'd been roommates during my 1 semester at Stanford, back when I still believed I was going to become a doctor, back before Peter needed rescuing, and I learned that my dreams were always going to be secondary. Sarah and I had stayed up late in our dorm room, talking about the future, about the lives we were going to build, the impact we were going to make. She was brilliant, funny, ambitious in a way that made ambition seem generous rather than selfish. When I'd left Stanford, we'd promised to stay in touch, but life happened and eventually our messages tapered off into nothing. Her LinkedIn message was short. Amanda, I heard you left Peter's Inc. I'm in town for a few days, want to grab coffee and catch up. I stared at that message for a long time. Part of me didn't want to see her. Sarah represented everything. I could have been the path I didn't take, the version of myself I'd sacrificed. But another part of me, the new part that was tired of being afraid, typed back, yes, tomorrow. We met at a cafe in downtown, one of those bright modern places with exposed brick and plants hanging from the ceiling. Sarah looked almost exactly the same, just older, more polished. She wore jeans and a blazer, her hair shorter than I remembered, and when she smiled, it still had that quality of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Amanda Lopez, Sham, she said, hugging me before we sat down. It's been way too long. 15 years, I said. I kept meaning to reach out. Life just gets so busy, you know. But I've been following your career on LinkedIn. I saw you were at Peter's Inc. That's your brother's company, right? It was. I'm not there anymore. Sarah ordered us both coffee and we spent the first 20 minutes catching up on the basics. She'd finished Stanford, gone on to MIT for a master's in computer science, worked at several tech companies before deciding to strike out on her own. She'd been building her own startup for the past year, self-funded, working out of her apartment in San Francisco, while contracting on the side to pay bills. "What about you?" she asked. "What happened at Peters Inc.?" I could have lied. Could have given her the corporate speak version about restructuring and new directions. But something about Sarah made me want to tell the truth. "My brother fired me," I said. "Told me I wasn't strategic enough. 2 weeks later, I found out he'd been using my identity to take out loans. $50,000 I didn't know about deposited into his account." Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "Jesus, Amanda." "Yeah. And did you report him?" "Not yet. I'm still deciding what to do." She was quiet for a moment, studying me. "You're different than I remember. Harder, maybe, or just clearer." "Both, probably." Sarah set down her coffee. "Can I tell you why I really wanted to meet?" "Please." "I'm building a health app for women over 40. Menopause, tracking hormone, monitoring symptom management, community support, all of it. The market is huge and completely underserved. Every tech company wants to build apps for 20-year-olds, but there are millions of women in their 40s and 50s who feel invisible, who have real health needs that nobody's addressing." I nodded, not sure where she was going with this. "I've got the technical side figured out," Sarah continued. "I can build the app, no problem. But I need someone who understands operations strategy, user experience, the business side. I need a co-founder who gets what these women are going through because she's lived it." She paused. "I need someone like you." The words took a moment to land. "You're offering me a job." "Not a job. A partnership. Co-founder, 50-50 equity split. No salary at first, obviously. We'd both be working for equity until we can fundraise or start generating revenue. But this could be something real, Amanda. This could help millions of women who feel exactly like we did back at Stanford. Invisible. Like our potential didn't matter. I thought about my $18,000 in savings, about the $50,000 in fraudulent debt hanging over my head, about the fact that I was 35 and starting over with nothing. "How much capital would I need to put in?" I asked. "Honestly, whatever you can. I've been bootstrapping this for a year and I've got enough to get us through development and initial testing. But if we want to scale, if we want to really build this right, we'd need real funding. Angel investors, maybe VC eventually." "I have about 30,000, I said. "That's everything. I was saving it for a house down payment." Sarah leaned forward. "I am not going to tell you this is a safe bet. Most startups fail. We could work our asses off for 2 years and end up with nothing. You could take that 30,000, find a stable job, rebuild slowly and safely." She met my eyes. "But, Amanda, this app could help millions of women who feel invisible, like we did, like you do right now. And even if it fails, at least you'll fail building something that matters, not working for someone else's dream." I thought about Peter sitting in that conference room telling me I wasn't strategic enough. I thought about my mother calling me selfish for objecting to fraud. I thought about 15 years of making myself smaller, quieter, less, always less, because that's what good daughters did. "I'm in," I heard myself say. Sarah's face broke into a huge smile. "Really? Really? What do we do first?" We spent the next 3 hours in that cafe, Sarah's laptop between us, sketching out plans. She showed me the prototype she'd built, walked me through the technical architecture, the user research she'd done, the gap in the market she was trying to fill. The more she talked, the more excited I became. This wasn't just a business opportunity. This was a chance to build something that mattered, something that would help women like me, women who'd been told their needs didn't matter. Their pain wasn't important. Their voices were too much or not enough. "We need a company name," Sarah said. I thought about it, about my name, the one Peter had stolen and used for fraud, the one that had always felt like it belonged more to my family's expectations than to me. AL Systems, I said. Amanda Lopez Systems. I want my name on this. My real name attached to something I'm building, not something someone's taking from me. Sarah nodded. I like it. Clean, professional doesn't limit us to one product line. Over the next week, we filed the incorporation papers, set up a business bank account, established operating agreements. I transferred $30,000, my entire safety net, into that account. Sarah matched it with her savings. We had $60,000 to build something from nothing. I worked from my apartment, setting up a home office in the corner of my living room. My landlord wasn't thrilled about me running a business from a residential space, but I kept it quiet, didn't have clients coming by, made sure it looked like I was just working remotely for someone else. My mother called one afternoon while I was deep in user research reading forums, where women talked about their health struggles and how invisible they felt to the medical system. Amanda, what are you doing for work? She asked. Have you found something yet? I'm doing consulting work, I said. It wasn't exactly a lie. Remote projects, flexible schedule. That's good. I'm glad you're being reasonable about everything. Peter asked about you the other day. He's concerned. I almost laughed. Peter, concerned. The same Peter who'd stolen my identity and fired me without warning. Tell him I'm fine, I said. You should call him yourself. Apologise for how you acted about the job situation. It would mean a lot to him. I'll think about it, I said, which meant no. After she hung up, I sat there looking at my laptop screen at the business plan Sarah and I were building at the incorporation documents with my name on them. Amanda Lopez, co-founder and COO AL Systems. For the first time in my life, I was keeping a secret from my family. I wasn't telling them what I was doing, wasn't asking for their approval or their input, wasn't making myself small enough to fit into their expectations. And it felt like freedom. Sarah came over that evening with Chinese takeout, and we worked until midnight, mapping out our development timeline, our target user demographics, our go-to-market strategy. At some point around 11, she pulled out the partnership agreement we'd drafted with a lawyer friend of hers. Last chance to back out, she said, only half joking. I took the pen and signed my name at the bottom of every page. Amanda Lopez. My signature, my choice, my risk. As I signed the partnership papers, Sarah smiled. If this works, it changes everything. I looked at her, at the papers, at my name written in ink, on a document that represented a future I was choosing for myself, not one someone else had chosen for me. It already has. I thought. Everything changed, but nobody knew it yet. That was the point. The work started immediately. Sarah and I agreed to launch by summer, which gave us 6 months to build something from nothing. 6 months to turn an idea and $60,000 into a functioning business. It sounded impossible when we said it out loud, so we stopped saying it out loud and just started working. January disappeared in a blur of learning curves and late nights. I'd never built a business from scratch before. At Peters Inc., I'd managed existing systems, optimized processes that other people had designed. This was different. This was starting with a blank screen and having to imagine everything into existence. Sarah handled the technical architecture writing code from her apartment in San Francisco while I worked from mine. We met virtually every morning at 6 before most people were awake to review progress and plan the day's work. Then we'd work independently until evening meeting again at 9 or 10 to troubleshoot problems and plan the next day. I taught myself the basics of digital marketing by watching YouTube videos and reading everything I could find. I learned about customer acquisition costs, conversion funnels, A/B testing, search engine optimization. I joined online forums where middle-aged women talked about their health struggles and read thousands of posts taking notes on the language they used, the problems they faced, the solutions they wished existed. I ate ramen for dinner most nights because it was cheap and took 2 minutes to prepare. My personal savings account dwindled to almost nothing. I stopped buying new clothes, stopped going out, stopped doing anything that cost money, and didn't directly contribute to building the business. My mother called every week to ask if I'd found a real job yet. I told her I was still consulting, still looking. She'd sigh and tell me about Peter's latest promotion or achievement, and I'd say, "That's great, Mum," and change the subject. I didn't tell her that I was working 16-hour days. I didn't tell her that I'd taught myself 3 new software platforms and could now build a basic website from scratch. I didn't tell her that Sarah and I were creating something that could actually matter. By March, we had a working prototype. We called it WowHer, a health tracking app specifically designed for women between 40 and 60. The name came from a late-night brainstorming session where Sarah said, "We should call it WellHer, like, well, here's something that actually sees you." We shortened it to one word, and it stuck. The app tracked menopause symptoms, hormone patterns, mood changes, sleep quality, all the things that women in this age group dealt with but nobody wanted to talk about. It had a community feature where users could connect with others going through similar experiences. It offered evidence-based information about treatment options, lifestyle changes, and when to talk to a doctor. Most importantly, it treated these women like they mattered, like their health concerns were legitimate, like they deserved to be seen. We launched a private beta in April with 50 users Sarah and I recruited from online forums. The feedback was overwhelming. Women wrote to us saying they'd been looking for something like this for years. They told us about dismissive doctors, about feeling invisible, about thinking they were crazy or weak for struggling with symptoms nobody took seriously. One woman wrote, "I've been trying to track my symptoms in a notebook, but I kept forgetting. This app reminds me, shows me patterns I couldn't see before, and makes me feel less alone. Thank you for building this." I read that message 3 times, then closed my laptop and cried for the first time since starting the business. Not from sadness, from recognition. I knew exactly how she felt. We officially launched in May. Sarah handled the technical infrastructure while I managed everything else. Customer service marketing, social media, user, onboarding, payment, processing, you name it. We had no office, no employees, just 2 women working from their apartments, meeting occasionally at coffee shops when Sarah flew down or I flew up. The growth started slowly. 10 users the first day, 50 by the end of the first week, 200 by the end of the first month. We charged a subscription fee of $9 per month, which meant we were bringing in $1,800 that first month. Barely enough to cover our server costs. But the growth didn't stop. Word spread organically, women telling their friends, posting in Facebook groups, writing reviews. By the end of June, we had 50,000 users. 50,000 women paying $9 a month to use something we'd built. I did the math one morning and had to sit down. We were generating $150,000 per month in subscription revenue. After costs, we were actually profitable, something most startups didn't achieve for years. Sarah called me that afternoon, her voice high with excitement. "Amanda, we're growing at 20% month over month. Do you know what that means? If we maintain this trajectory, we'll hit 100,000 users by fall." "I know," I said, but I was smiling so hard, my face hurt. "I've had 3 angel investors reach out this week asking about funding rounds. Real investors, Amanda? People with serious money who want to be part of this." That's when Sarah suggested we do a PR push. Reach out to tech blogs, women's magazines, maybe try to get featured in some local news outlets. Get the story out there about 2 women building a health app that actually served an underserved market. I said no. "Why not?" Sarah asked, confused. "This is good news. This is the kind of story people want to hear." "I know, but I don't want to tell it yet." "Why?" I thought about how to explain it, about my family, about Peter, about spending 35 years being told I wasn't enough, about learning that sometimes the best revenge isn't confrontation, it's building something so undeniable that they can't look away. "Let the work speak," I finally said. "When the time is right, they'll see. But If we announce it now while we're still small, people will find ways to dismiss it. They'll say we got lucky, or the market's too niche, or we'll never scale. I want to wait until we're big enough that none of that matters. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Who are you worried about dismissing it? People who don't matter, I said, which was only partially true. She let it drop, but I could tell she didn't entirely understand. How could she? Sarah hadn't spent 15 years watching her accomplishments get minimized and her brothers get celebrated. She hadn't learned that sometimes silence is more powerful than shouting. I had learned something crucial from my family, though they'd never intended to teach it. I'd learned that you don't change people's minds by arguing with them. You change their minds by becoming something they can't ignore. So, I kept my head down and kept working. I didn't update my LinkedIn. I didn't post on social media. I didn't tell my mother that my consulting work was actually a growing business that was helping thousands of women. When she called to tell me about Peter's latest achievement, I said, "That's wonderful," and meant it because his success had nothing to do with mine anymore. In late June, my mother invited me to lunch. We met at her favourite restaurant, the same place we'd been going since I was a teenager. She ordered her usual salad and spent the first 15 minutes talking about Peter's new house, about his new girlfriend, about how proud she was of everything he'd accomplished. Then she turned to me with that particular expression of gentle concern that always made me feel like I was failing. "Amanda, are you still just doing consulting work? Don't you think it's time to find a stable job? You're 36 now. You need to think about your future." I took a sip of water and smiled. I am thinking about my future mum every day. But consulting isn't stable. You need benefits, retirement security. "I know what I need," I said quietly. She frowned, sensing something in my tone she couldn't quite identify. "You're not still upset about the situation with Peter, are you? Because he's worried about you? He thinks you're struggling and too proud to ask for help." I almost laughed. Peter worried about me. Peter who'd stolen my identity and $50,000. Peter who'd fired me and told me I wasn't strategic enough. "Tell him I'm doing fine," I said. "Better than fine, actually." "Then why won't you tell me what you're doing? Why are you being so secretive?" "Because you'll tell Peter," I thought. "Because you'll minimize it. Because I'm not ready for you to see it yet. I'm just working mum, building something. When there's something worth sharing, I'll share it." That evening, Sarah video called me. "I'm serious about the PR question. We've got momentum, we've got a good story, and I think we should capitalize on it. Are you sure you don't want to put ourselves out there?" "I'm sure," I said. "Let them think I'm still small. Let them think I'm still struggling. When the time comes when we're too big to dismiss, that's when they'll see." Sarah studied me through the screen. "This isn't just about business for you, is it?" "No," I admitted. "It's not." "Fair enough. But Amanda, when that moment comes when you're ready to show them what you've built, I want to be there to see their faces." I smiled. "Deal." Sarah asked if I'd tell my family. I said, "Not yet. Let them think I'm still small. It'll make the moment bigger." The wedding invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks before I decided to go. It was thick cream cardstock with embossed gold lettering, the kind that announces itself as expensive before you even open the envelope. Peter's daughter, Emma, was getting married and the whole family would be there. I almost threw it away. I had legitimate reasons to skip it. Well, her was at a critical growth stage. We were in conversations with investors, and I genuinely didn't have time for a weekend consumed by family obligations. But something made me RSVP, yes. Maybe curiosity. Maybe a desire to see them one more time before everything changed. Maybe I just wanted to see if they'd notice anything different about me. They didn't. The wedding was held at a country club in December. Everything decorated in white and silver with tiny lights everywhere, making it look like a winter wonderland. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing fancy, and arrived alone. The parking lot was full of expensive cars, and I walked in, past valets and coat check attendants, to the reception hall where cocktail hour was already underway. My mother spotted me immediately. She was holding court near the bar with Aunt Teresa and several other relatives wearing a champagne-coloured dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. When she saw me, her expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, evaluation, then something that might have been disappointment. "Amanda," she said, loud enough for the group around her to hear, "you came. I wasn't sure you would." Of course I came. Emma's my niece. She turned to introduce me to the relatives, most of whom I'd met at various family gatherings over the years. "This is my daughter Amanda. She's between jobs right now doing some consulting work." The way she said consulting made it sound temporary, almost embarrassing, like I was between real opportunities and filling time with whatever I could find. I smiled and shook hands, not bothering to correct her. Peter appeared with his girlfriend on his arm, wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He'd aged well, looked successful and comfortable in a way I'd never quite managed at family events. When he saw me, he smiled in that way that was supposed to be friendly, but felt more like tolerating an obligation. "Amanda, good to see you, sis." He gave me a brief hug that didn't quite commit. "How's the job hunt going? Find anything yet?" "I'm working," I said simply. Right, the consulting thing. Mum mentioned that, still doing that little online thing." He said it the way you'd talk about a hobby, something cute but not serious, something like that. He nodded, already losing interest, and turned to talk to someone more important. His daughter Emma came by briefly to thank me for coming, and I gave her a card with a check inside a modest amount that I could actually afford now, but wouldn't seem like I was trying too hard. The reception began, and I found myself seated at a table near the back, away from the family tables up front. I was placed with distant cousins and family friends, people who made polite conversation and then mostly ignored me. I watched the toasts from far away, the speeches about love and future and family, Emma beaming in her white dress, Peter, proud and teary-eyed. Then my mother stood up to give a toast. She tapped her glass and the room quieted. She had that way of commanding attention, of making people want to listen. She spoke about watching Emma grow up, about the joy of seeing her granddaughter so happy, about the importance of family and tradition. Then she turned to Peter. "I want to say something about my son Peter. I am so proud of him. He built everything from nothing, worked so hard for this family, and gave his daughter this beautiful life." She paused and people murmured in agreement. "He's everything a mother could hope for." I felt it coming before she said it. That instinct you develop when you've been the unfavourable comparison your whole life. "And my daughter Amanda?" She found me in the crowd and people turned to look. "Well, she's still trying to find her way, still figuring out what she wants to be when she grows up." Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room. If only she had Peter's drive, his focus, his ambition. Maybe she'd be married by now too, giving me more grandchildren. More laughter, louder this time. Someone near me whispered something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the tone. Pitying. My mother raised her glass. "To Emma and Jacob, and to building the lives you want. May you have my son's determination, and not my daughter's uncertainty." Everyone drank. Everyone except me. I sat there at that back table, surrounded by people who were now glancing at me with sympathy or curiosity or satisfaction, and I felt something settle over me like a cloak. Not anger, not hurt, something clearer than that. Something final. I stood up, not dramatically, just calmly, the way you'd stand when it was time to leave. I picked up my small clutch purse, slipped out of my heels, and walked toward the front of the room in my bare feet. People watched me confused. The room got quieter. My mother's expression shifted from satisfaction to concern as I approached the family table where she stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just placed my heels on the table in front of her, the navy pumps looking out of place among the crystal and silver. "I don't need to fit into your idea of success anymore, Mum," I said quietly, but in the silence everyone heard. "I never did." I just spent too many years thinking I had to. My mother's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I looked at Peter, at my mother, at the relatives watching with wide eyes. Thank you for inviting me. Congratulations to Emma. I hope she builds a life that makes her happy, not one that makes other people comfortable. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. My bare feet were silent on the polished floor. Behind me, I could hear whispers starting confused murmurs, someone saying my name. But I didn't turn around. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I walked through the reception hall, past the coat checkout into the December night. It was cold and my feet hurt on the pavement, but I made it to my car and sat there in the driver's seat for a long moment, not starting the engine, just breathing. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. How dare you embarrass this family? Come back inside right now. I turned off my phone. Another text came through before the screen went dark, this one from Peter. Really, Amanda, at Emma's wedding, this is a new low, even for you. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. I thought about, her, about the 150,000 women using our app right now, about the Series A term sheet, sitting in my email inbox from a VC firm that wanted to invest $5 million. I thought about Sarah, who texted me earlier today, asking if we should accept the term sheet or negotiate for better terms. I thought about walking out of that wedding, barefoot, leaving my shoes on my mother's table like a resignation letter from the family I'd never really been part of. And smiled. My whole life I'd been trying to fit into shoes that didn't fit, trying to walk the path they'd laid out, trying to be small enough, quiet enough, good enough to earn a place at their table. But those shoes hurt. They'd always hurt. And I was done pretending they didn't. I started the car and drove home through the quiet streets, streetlights reflecting off the windshield, Christmas decorations glowing in windows. Somewhere behind me, the wedding continued without me. They talk about this for months, probably years. The daughter who embarrassed the family, the sister who couldn't handle a joke, the woman who walked out of her niece's wedding barefoot because she couldn't take criticism. Let them talk. Let them tell whatever story made them feel better about what had happened tonight. I knew the truth. I knew that I'd just done something I should have done years ago. I'd chosen myself. I'd walked away from people who would never see me, never value me, never understand that their version of success had nothing to do with mine. As I walked out barefoot under the stars, I whispered to myself, the good girl was gone, and I'd never felt freer. Freedom, I discovered, came with its own set of complications. 3 weeks after I walked out of Emma's wedding, my phone was still full of unread messages from my family. Voicemails from my mother demanding I apologize. Texts from Peter calling me selfish and ungrateful. Even a few messages from relatives I barely knew telling me I should be ashamed of embarrassing the family at such an important event. I deleted them all without listening. For the first time in my life, their opinions didn't matter to me. I had bigger concerns. Sarah called me on a Tuesday morning in early January, her voice unusually serious. We need to talk about legal protection, like immediately. We met at our usual coffee shop, the one halfway between her apartment and mine. She had her laptop open before I even sat down, showing me articles about startup founders who'd been sued by former employers, family members, or business partners. Look at this one, she said, pointing to a case where a founder's previous company claimed ownership of the new startup's intellectual property. And this one where a co-founder's family sued, claiming they had rights to the business because of some informal conversation years earlier. You think Peter's going to sue us? I asked. I think Peter's going to do something. You humiliated him at his daughter's wedding in front of everyone who matters to him. Men like that don't just let things go. She closed the laptop and looked at me directly. We need a lawyer. A good one. Someone who knows corporate law, intellectual property, and how to fight dirty if we need to. Do you know someone? Sarah smiled. Actually, yes. Someone who knows your brother very well. Daniel Rivera. He used to work for Peters Inc. as their in-house IP counsel. I felt my stomach drop. Someone who worked for Peter Sarah, that's a terrible idea. Hear me out. Daniel quit about a year ago, walked away from a 6-figure salary because he couldn't stomach how Peter operated. I know him from law school, we stayed in touch. He's ethical, he's brilliant, and he knows every trick Peter might try because he watched him do it to other people. What made him quit? Peter was stealing ideas from junior employees. They'd pitch something in a meeting, Peter would take credit, develop it under his own name, and the original person would get nothing. Daniel was supposed to structure the IP agreements to make it legal. He refused and resigned instead. I sat back in my chair processing this. Someone who'd seen Peter's true nature and walked away from money and prestige because it was wrong. That said something. Can I meet him? I asked. I already called him. He can meet tomorrow if you're free. Daniel Rivera's office was in a shared workspace downtown, the kind of place where freelance lawyers and consultants rented desks by the month. He was younger than I expected, maybe 32, with dark hair, starting to grey at the temples, and the kind of focused intensity that made you feel like you had his complete attention. He shook my hand firmly when we met. Amanda Lopez, Sarah's told me a lot about you. Hopefully, good things. She told me you walked out of your brother's daughter's wedding barefoot after your mother publicly humiliated you. I'd say that qualifies as good. I liked him immediately. We spent the next 2 hours in a conference room while Daniel reviewed everything. The incorporation documents, the shareholder agreements Sarah and I had signed, our partnership structure, every contract we'd executed. He took notes in a leather journal, asking questions that were both detailed and unsettling. Did you work on any aspect of Wellher while you were still employed at Peters Inc.? He asked. No, I was fired in late October. We started the company in January. Did you ever discuss health apps, women's wellness, or anything related to this business model with anyone at Peters Inc.? Never. The idea came entirely from Sarah. I didn't even know she was working on it until after I left the company. Daniel made more notes. Here's the problem. Peter could argue that the idea came from company resources, family conversations, or documents you had access to during your employment. He doesn't need to be right. He just needs to create enough doubt to tie you up in litigation for years and scare away investors. Sarah leaned forward. Can he actually do that? Just make up a claim? He can file a lawsuit claiming anything he wants. Whether he wins is different from whether he can cause you massive problems in the meantime. Daniel looked at me. Has he made any threats? Said anything that suggests he's thinking along these lines? I thought about the identity theft, about the $50,000 in fraudulent loans I still hadn't reported. He's stolen from me before, used my social security number to take out loans without my permission. Daniel's pen stopped moving. When? About 10 months ago, $50,000 deposited into his business account. Did you file a police report? No. Why not? I didn't have a good answer. Because he was my brother. Because I was raised to protect family. Because I'd spent 35 years being told that making trouble was worse than being hurt. I should have, I said finally. Daniel studied me for a long moment. That loan is leverage. If he comes after you legally, you can threaten to report the identity theft. But it's also a vulnerability because he might file preemptively to paint you as the aggressor. He closed his journal. We need to build a fortress around this company, make it legally impossible for him to claim any ownership or control. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel became a fixture in our operation. He set up a comprehensive documentation system where every decision, every line of code, every business conversation was recorded and timestamped. We moved all our documents to a blockchain-authenticated cloud storage system that could prove exactly when each file was created and by whom. He reviewed every email I'd ever sent or received during my time at Peters Inc., looking for any mention of health apps, women's wellness, or anything Peter could twist into evidence. There was nothing. My work had been in operations and customer service completely unrelated to product development. Daniel filed provisional patents for Wellher's key features all registered under my name and Sarah's individually, not the company. If anyone tries to claim corporate ownership, we can prove personal invention, he explained. The most important thing he did was revise our shareholder agreement. Sarah and I sat in Daniel's office while he walked us through the new language, pointing out clauses about hostile takeover protection and anti-dilution provisions. This section here, he said, tapping a paragraph dense with legal terminology, is a poison pill provision. If anyone tries to acquire more than 30% of company shares without board approval, their voting rights automatically get restricted. It makes hostile takeovers essentially impossible. Do we really need that? Sarah asked. We're a startup. Who's going to try to take us over? Daniel looked at me. Someone who has money connections and a grudge. Someone who'd rather destroy what you've built than see you succeed. I understood. He was talking about Peter. There's one more thing, Daniel said. He pulled out a separate document. This is a personal protection order we can file if Peter or anyone in your family attempts to interfere with the business through harassment threats or intimidation. We don't file it now, but we have it ready, just in case. The amount of detail, the level of preparation, the way Daniel anticipated problems I hadn't even considered, it was like having armour built around something I'd been protecting with just hope and determination. How much is this going to cost? I asked, because we were still a young company and legal fees could bleed us dry. I'll work for equity, Daniel said. 1% vesting over 4 years. If you succeed, I succeed. If Peter comes after you, I want to be there to stop him. Not for the money. Because I've seen what he does to people and I'm tired of watching him win. Sarah and I exchanged glances. We nodded. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone preparing for battle. Good. Then let's make sure every single vulnerability is covered. Your brother thinks you're defenseless. A lot of people probably think that. Let's keep it that way until it's too late for them to do anything about it. The fortress took 2 weeks to complete. By the end of January, Her was protected by layers of legal structure that would make any attack costly, time-consuming, and likely to fail. Every document was authenticated, every patent filed, every potential vulnerability addressed. Daniel walked me through the final version of everything on a Friday afternoon. We sat in his office, and he showed me how all the pieces fit together, how each protection reinforced the others, how we'd built something that could withstand almost any legal challenge. You're safe now, he said, or as safe as you can be in business. But Amanda, there's something you need to understand. All of this protection is defensive. If your brother comes after you, we can defend successfully. But defense isn't the same as offense. If he attacks, it's still going to be painful, expensive, and public. I know, I said. Do you? Because from what Sarah's told me, your family isn't the type to fight fair. They'll go after your reputation, your character, maybe even try to turn your success into something shameful. Are you ready for that? I thought about walking out of that wedding barefoot, about the messages I'd deleted, about 35 years of being invisible and the last 10 months of building something that mattered. I'm ready, I said. Daniel looked at me and said, Your brother thinks you're defenseless. Let's keep it that way until it's too late. The phone call came at 2:17 in the morning. I was deep asleep dreaming about something I wouldn't remember when the buzzing pulled me awake. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, squinting at the bright screen, expecting it to be Sarah with some urgent technical issue, or maybe a spam call I could ignore. It was a number I didn't recognize. Local area code. Something made me answer. Hello. Is this Amanda Lopez? A woman's voice, professional, slightly tired. Yes. Who is this, gendarme? This is Mercy General Hospital. Your mother, Maria Lopez, was brought to the emergency room about an hour ago. She's listed you as her emergency contact. We need you to come in as soon as possible. I was already getting out of bed, pulling on jeans. What happened? Is she okay? She had what appears to be a mild heart attack. She's stable now, but we need family here for consent forms and to discuss her care. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I drove through empty streets, traffic lights blinking yellow at deserted intersections. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was racing. A heart attack. My mother was 68 years old, generally healthy, except for high blood pressure she took medication for. Or was supposed to take medication for. I realised I didn't actually know if she took it consistently. I didn't know much about her daily life anymore. We hadn't spoken in 2 months. The hospital parking lot was mostly empty at this hour. I found a spot near the emergency entrance and walked through automatic doors into fluorescent brightness. The smell hit me immediately, that particular hospital combination of antiseptic and anxiety. The nurse at the desk checked my ID and directed me to room 12. I walked down the corridor, passing other rooms with curtains drawn, hearing the beep of monitors and low conversations between night shift staff. My mother was in a bed with rails up connected to an IV and a heart monitor that beeped steadily. She looked small under the white blanket, older than I remembered, her hair loose and grey against the pillow instead of the careful style she usually maintained. She was asleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her. A doctor came by, young, maybe early 30s, with exhausted eyes. She explained that my mother had experienced a mild heart attack, probably stress-related combined with poorly managed blood pressure. They'd stabilised her run tests and she'd need to stay for observation for at least 24 hours. Is she going to be okay? I asked. She should be with proper medication and lifestyle changes. Does she live alone? Yes. She'll need someone to check on her regularly, make sure she's taking her medications, watching her diet, managing stress. Do you live nearby? About 30 minutes away. The doctor nodded, made some notes on her tablet. We'll have a social worker talk to you about care options before discharge. For now, you can sit with her. She should wake up in the next few hours. After the doctor left, I pulled us a chair next to the bed and sat down. The room was quiet, except for the monitor beeping and the soft hiss of the blood pressure cuff inflating automatically every 15 minutes. I should call Peter, I thought. He's her son. He should know. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. It went to voicemail immediately, meaning he'd turned his phone off or was in an area without service. I left a message. Peter, it's Amanda. Mom had a heart attack. She's at Mercy General Room 12 in the ER. She's stable, but you should know. Then I tried calling his office, got his assistant who informed me that Mr. Lopez was in Tokyo for a conference and wasn't available. Can you reach him? This is about his mother. It's urgent. I'll send him an email and flag it as urgent, but he specifically requested not to be disturbed during this trip unless it's business critical. Business critical. His mother having a heart attack apparently didn't qualify. I hung up and sat there looking at my phone. 30 seconds later, it rang. Peter. Amanda, I got your message. What happened? I explained about the heart attack, that she was stable but needed to stay in the hospital for observation. Okay, he said. There was noise in the background, voices speaking Japanese, the sound of what might be a hotel lobby or restaurant. Well, that's good that she's stable. Thanks for letting me know. Peter, you need to come back. She's in the hospital. I'm in Tokyo for a major conference. I can't just leave. The keynote's tomorrow, and I've got meetings scheduled for the next 3 days. Your mother had a heart attack. And you said she's stable. The doctors are taking care of her. Look, I appreciate you being there, but you can handle this. You're good at this kind of thing. I'll call her when she's awake and feeling better. You can't fly back for 2 days, not even to see her. His voice shifted, becoming irritated. Don't do that. Don't make me the bad guy because I have professional obligations. Mum would understand. She's always understood that my work is important. Right, I said. Your work. Just handle it okay. Keep me updated if anything changes. I need to go. He hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, staring at the screen until it went dark. Then I set it on the small table next to the bed and reached for my mother's hand. It was cool, dry, smaller than I remembered. When had her hands gotten so small? I held her hand and waited. She woke around 5 a.m, eyes fluttering open, confused at first about where she was. I watched her take in the room, the IV, the monitors, and then finally noticed me sitting beside her. Amanda, her voice was scratchy weak. I'm here, Mum. You're in the hospital. You had a mild heart attack, but you're going to be okay. She nodded slowly, trying to process this. Then her eyes moved past me, scanning the room. Where's Peter? The question hit exactly where it always did, even here, even now. He's in Tokyo for a conference. He can't fly back right away, but he called and he knows you're okay. Tokyo. She said it like it explained everything. Like, of course he couldn't be here because he was doing something important. He works so hard for the family. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I just squeezed her hand gently. How are you feeling? Do you need anything? Water. Should I call the nurse? I'm tired, she said. So tired. Then rest. I'll be right here. She looked at me, then really looked at me. And for a moment, I thought maybe this would be different. Maybe this would be the moment she finally saw me, finally understood what it meant that I'd driven here at 2 a.m, that I was sitting beside her holding her hand, while her beloved son conducted business halfway around the world. But her eyes held the same disappointment they always did. The same subtle judgment that told me I still wasn't quite right, quite enough. You don't have to stay, she said. I'm sure you have things to do, job interviews or whatever. I'm staying, I said. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. I sat there as the sky outside the window slowly shifted from black to deep blue to the pale grey of early dawn. I watched my mother breathe, watched the monitors track her heart, watched nurses come and go to check vitals and adjust medications. And at some point, around 6 a.m, when the hospital started coming alive with the day shift arriving, and breakfast carts rolling down hallways, tears started running down my face. Not dramatic crying, just silent tears that I didn't bother to wipe away. Why was I here? Why was I holding the hand of a woman who'd spent my entire life making me feel invisible? Why did I drive through the night for someone who, even in a hospital bed, still couldn't see me as anything more than a disappointing alternative to her son? The answer came quietly, clearly, without drama or revelation. Just simple truth. Because I love you, Mum. Even when you don't see me. Even when it hurts. Even when you make it clear that I'll never be what you wanted. I love you. Not the person you could have been, not some imaginary mother who would have protected me and valued me and fought for me the way you fought for Peter. Just you. The flawed, wounded, limited person you actually are. I love you. And that's why I'm here. Not because I'm hoping you'll finally change. Not because I think this will be the moment you realise my worth. But because, despite everything, despite years of being second best and invisible and insufficient, I still love you. And that's my choice, not something you earned or something you gave me permission to feel. Just my choice. But it's also a choice that doesn't require me to keep shrinking myself to fit into your narrow definition of worthy. I can love you and still build a life that has nothing to do with your approval. I can be here tonight and still walk away tomorrow into a future where your disappointment doesn't determine my worth. This was the last time I'd sit in a hospital room hoping that maybe, finally, you'd see me. After tonight, I'd do things for myself, build my life for myself, succeed or fail on my own terms, not as a reflection of whether I measured up to Peter or lived down to your expectations. I could love you and still be free. Those two things weren't mutually exclusive. It just took me 36 years to figure that out. As dawn broke through the hospital window, I realised love shouldn't hurt this much. But it did. And that was about to change. Change came with a return address from a law firm I didn't recognize. 2 weeks after leaving my mother's house with careful instructions about her medications and appointments, she'd probably ignore I came home from a meeting with potential investors to find a large manila envelope wedged into my apartment door. The return address read, Mitchell Hartley and Associates Attorneys at Law. I knew what it was before I opened it. You don't get envelopes from lawyers that feel this heavy unless someone's trying to hurt you. Inside was a civil complaint. 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to this. Peter was suing me for $5 million, claiming I'd stolen intellectual property from family business discussions and used my position as his sister to gain confidential information that I'd then used to build a competing company. The demands were clear. Shut down. Well, her immediately. Turn over all assets and intellectual property. Pay $5 million in damages for loss of business opportunity and reputational harm. I read it 3 times, standing in my kitchen, the sun setting outside my window, my hands surprisingly steady. Then I called Daniel. He arrived at my apartment within an hour, read through the complaint while I made coffee neither of us drank, and finally set the papers down with a heavy breath. This is what we prepared for, he said. Every protection we built was for exactly this. Can he win? No, but he can make the next 6 months of your life extremely difficult and expensive. That's the point. He wants you to fold to shut down the company and disappear rather than fight. I'm not folding. I know, that's why we're going to war. The first hearing was scheduled for April, 2 months away. Peter's lawyers filed motion after motion in the meantime, each one requiring Daniel to respond, each one costing time and money and energy. They demanded access to our servers, our financial records, our communications. They subpoenaed Sarah, demanding she sit for a deposition. They claimed Amanda Lopez was a false identity I'd created to hide my theft of Peter's ideas. Wow, hair kept growing through all of it, but the lawsuit hung over everything like a storm cloud. Investors got nervous. Some of our term sheets fell through. The ones who stayed demanded we put money in escrow to cover potential damages. Sarah wanted to fight publicly to tell the press that Peter was trying to destroy his sister's company out of spite. Daniel advised against it. Let him look like the aggressor. Let him be the one attacking a small startup founded by 2 women. When we win, and we will win, the optics will be even worse for him. In May, 3 months into the litigation, we had a preliminary hearing. This was the first time I'd see Peter since the wedding, since my mother's heart attack, since any of this began. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-panelled and quiet. Peter sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 expensive lawyers in matching navy suits. He wore a charcoal suit I'd seen him wear to board meetings, his hair perfectly styled, his expression confident and slightly bored, as if this was just another business transaction. My mother sat in the gallery behind him. She'd come to support her son. I sat at the defense table with Daniel Sarah beside me for moral support, wearing the one professional blazer I owned and trying to look like someone who hadn't spent the last 3 months drowning in legal paperwork and anxiety. Peter's lead attorney stood up a man named Richard Mitchell, who probably cost $500 an hour, and began his argument. Peter Lopez had created the blueprint for a health technology company focused on underserved markets. He'd shared these ideas with family, including his sister, during casual conversations. She'd then taken those ideas, used her intimate knowledge of his business methods gained while working at his company, and built a competing business. My client's sister, Mitchell said, making sister sound like an accusation, had unique access to confidential business strategies. She abused that family relationship, that trust, for personal gain. Daniel stood for our response. He was calmer than Mitchell, quieter, but somehow more present. Your Honour, my client worked in customer service operations at Peters Inc. She had 0 involvement in product development or strategic planning. She never signed a non-compete agreement because her work was considered non-strategic. The entire premise of this lawsuit is that family conversations about health and wellness somehow constitute proprietary business information. That's absurd. But then came the moment I'd been dreading. Mitchell called my mother to testify. She walked to the witness stand, slowly wearing a cream-coloured suit and her hair done, her expression composed. She didn't look at me as she was sworn in. Mitchell approached her gently. "Mrs. Lopez, you're the mother of both the plaintiff and the defendant in this case." "Yes." "That must be very difficult for you." "It is." Her voice was soft, sad, the voice of a woman caught in the middle of something she hadn't asked for. "Mrs. Lopez, did you ever observe your daughter Amanda accessing work documents belonging to your son Peter?" My mother looked at Peter, then at me, then back at Mitchell. "Yes, during Christmas 2021, I saw her looking at papers from Peter's briefcase when he stepped away from the table." My heart stopped. Mitchell nodded sympathetically. "And did this seem unusual to you?" "Yes, she wasn't supposed to be looking at his work papers. It seemed like she was searching for something." Daniel stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honour. Speculation about my client's mental state." "Sustained." But the damage was done. My mother had testified that she'd seen me going through Peter's documents. In front of a judge under oath, she'd sided with him. When Daniel cross-examined her, he was gentle but precise. "Mrs. Lopez, you mentioned papers from a briefcase. Do you know what those papers were?" "No, I didn't look at them closely." "So you can't testify about their content or whether they were confidential?" "No." Daniel pulled out a document and showed it to the judge, then to my mother. "These are SEC filings from Peters Inc., publicly available on the internet. Anyone can access them. If these were the papers in question, there would be nothing inappropriate about my client reading them. Would you agree?" My mother looked uncertain. "I suppose. And Mrs. Lopez, isn't it true that you've had limited contact with your daughter over the past year, and most of your information about her business comes from your son?" "We haven't been close lately." "No." "So you don't actually know what your daughter does day to day, what her company builds or how it operates?" "Not in detail." Daniel thanked her and sat down. She left the witness stand without looking at me, went back to sit behind Peter, her hands folded in her lap. The preliminary hearing ended with the judge declining to dismiss the case, which meant it would go to full trial. We had 3 more months of legal battle ahead. Those months were brutal. Every week brought a new hearing, a new motion, a new attempt by Peter's lawyers to find some vulnerability in our defence. Sarah was deposed for 6 hours. Our financial records were examined. Expert witnesses were hired to analyse our code and our business model. Daniel never wavered. Every attack was met with a documented defence. Every claim was countered with evidence. He was methodical, exhaustive, and completely unshakable. In August, 6 months after the lawsuit began, we had the final trial. The courtroom was fuller this time. Peter had brought colleagues from his company, creating an audience that made it feel like a performance. My mother sat in the same spot as before. A few reporters had shown up, having caught wind that this was a sibling lawsuit involving a growing tech company. Peter's team presented their case first. Expert witnesses who suggested our business model was suspiciously similar to strategic documents from Peters Inc. Financial analysts who claimed our success was too fast to be organic, suggesting we'd had inside information. Character witnesses who painted me as the bitter sister, who'd always envied her successful brother. Then it was our turn. Daniel stood and began with the metadata. He showed the judge detailed logs of every line of code written for WoW, her every file created, every commit made to our GitHub repository. All of it was time-stamped, none of it connected to any Peters Inc. server or system. Peter's expert witness countered that metadata could be manipulated, that timestamps could be forged. For a moment, I felt everything slipping away. All our preparation, all our documentation, and they were claiming we'd faked it. Then Daniel stood again and his voice was calm as still water. "Your Honour, I'd like to submit additional evidence." These are blockchain verification records from GitHub, a public code repository. Every single commit made by Ms. Lopez and Ms. Chen was automatically recorded on an immutable public ledger with cryptographic verification. These records cannot be altered, backdated, or forged. The technology prevents it. Every line of code for Wellher was written after Ms. Lopez left Peter's Inc. This is mathematically provable. The judge leaned forward, interested now. Peter's lawyers looked at each other, but Daniel wasn't finished. Additionally, Your Honor, during our investigation, we discovered something troubling. Mr. Lopez illegally accessed Ms. Lopez's personal email account. We have server logs showing 47 unauthorized login attempts from an IP address registered to Peter's Inc., specifically from the executive floor during after hours, when security badge logs show only one person present, Peter Lopez himself. The courtroom went silent. Daniel projected the logs on a screen, dates, times, IP addresses, security badge entries. 47 attempts to break into my email looking for something he could use against me. Peter's face went pale. His lawyers started whispering urgently. The judge looked at the evidence, then at Peter, then back at Daniel. Mr. Rivera, are you saying the plaintiff in this case committed a federal crime against the defendant? Yes, Your Honor. Unauthorized access to electronic communications. We have the evidence documented and ready to turn over to federal prosecutors if necessary. The judge set down his pen. Mr. Mitchell, does your client have a response to this? Mitchell tried to argue that the logs could be misinterpreted, that there might be innocent explanations, but his voice had lost its confidence. The judge held up his hand. I've heard enough. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Lopez, I'm referring this matter to the California State Bar Ethics Committee for investigation into whether this lawsuit was filed in bad faith. Additionally, I'm ordering you to pay the defendant's legal fees. He looked at Peter with something like disgust. This court does not appreciate being used as a weapon in personal vendettas. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Mom's face went white. Peter stood frozen, his lawyers gathering papers frantically. And I finally breathed. Victory, I learned, doesn't mean the war is over. Sometimes it just means your opponent changes weapons. The week after the trial, I let myself believe it was finished. The court had dismissed Peter's lawsuit, ordered him to pay our legal fees, and referred him to the ethics board for filing a bad faith case. The tech press had picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath tale of a sister standing up to her powerful brother's attempts to crush her startup. Sarah and I went out for dinner at an actual restaurant, not the cheap places we'd been surviving on during the lean months. Daniel joined us, and we toasted to survival, to justice, to the fact that Wellher had not only weathered the storm, but grown through it. We had over 400,000 users now. The Series A funding had closed. We were hiring our first employees. We'd won. That was Sunday night. By Monday morning, everything was on fire. I woke up to my phone buzzing continuously. Text messages, emails, notifications flooding in faster than I could read them. I grabbed my phone confused and saw Sarah's message at the top. Call me now. We have a problem. I called. She answered before the first ring finished. Have you seen Tech Daily? Her voice was tight with panic. No, I just woke up. What's going on? Rebecca Chen published an article about us. It's bad, Amanda. Really bad. I put her on speaker and opened my laptop. Tech Daily was one of the most respected tech news sites known for investigative journalism and careful fact-checking. Rebecca Chen was a senior writer there, someone I'd interviewed with 6 months ago for a piece about women founders in health tech. She'd seemed genuinely interested in our mission, asked thoughtful questions, and promised to cover us when we were ready to go public with our story. The headline loaded on my screen. Well, her founder accused of selling user health data to insurance companies. Anonymous sources claim massive privacy violations. My stomach dropped. The article was detailed, professional, and devastating. It claimed that anonymous sources inside Wellher had revealed we were secretly selling user health data to insurance companies who were using it to deny coverage or increase premiums for women with certain symptoms. The article included quotes from concerned employees about unethical business practices and pressure to monetize user data despite privacy promises. It cited our rapid growth and recent funding as evidence we'd found a lucrative revenue stream beyond subscriptions. It questioned how a small startup could achieve such success so quickly without cutting ethical corners. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. My phone showed 300 unread emails, user complaints, cancellation requests, press inquiries. I opened Twitter and saw our company name trending with thousands of users expressing outrage and betrayal. I trusted Wellhair with my private health information and they sold it. Women's health apps are all the same. They pretend to care but only want our data. Deleting my account immediately. Can't believe I paid for this. I called Sarah back. None of this is true. We've never sold user data. We don't even have partnerships with insurance companies. Where did this come from? I don't know, but it's destroying us. We've had 1,200 cancellations in the last hour. Our support email is overwhelmed. And Amanda, some of our investors are calling for an emergency audit. Daniel called next. I conferenced him in with Sarah. This is a coordinated attack, he said immediately. Professional, expensive, and strategic. Someone paid for this. Rebecca Chen isn't the type to publish lies, I said. I met her. She's careful, ethical. She wouldn't run something like this without verification. Then we need to find out what verification she thinks she has, Daniel said. I'll contact Tech Daily's legal department and request their sources. In the meantime, don't respond publicly. Don't engage. Let me handle it. But the damage was already spreading. By noon, the story had been picked up by mainstream news outlets. By evening, we were trending on every social platform. Users weren't just cancelling, they were angry, posting screenshots of their health data and demanding to know which insurance companies had bought it. Except none of them had, because we'd never sold anything. Sarah worked through the night with a cybersecurity expert she'd hired months ago for a different project. I sat in my apartment watching our user numbers drop, watching years of trust evaporate in hours, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. At 3 a.m, Sarah called. I found it. Her voice was exhausted but sharp. The article was paid for, $50,000 from a Delaware shell company called Pinnacle Holdings LLC. Money trail goes back 6 months, payment made 2 weeks after the trial ended. Pinnacle Holdings. The name was familiar. The same company Peter used when he tried to buy up our shares for the proxy takeover. Amanda, your brother, paid Rebecca Chen $50,000 to write this article. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Rebecca wouldn't do that. She has integrity. People have prices, Sarah said quietly, and $50,000 is a lot of money for a freelance journalist. I've got the bank records, the contract, everything. Peter paid her to destroy us. Daniel arrived at my apartment at 6 a.m. with coffee and a legal pad full of notes. We can sue for defamation. We can file criminal charges for fraud. We can destroy him for this. I stared at the laptop screen showing our declining user numbers, the angry posts, the news articles multiplying across the internet. Every option Daniel listed would take months, maybe years. Lawsuits, investigations, trials. By the time we proved it was false, Wellhair would be dead. No, I said. Amanda, we have evidence. I know, but if we sue, it becomes a legal battle. He said, she said. The story becomes about the fight, not about the truth. And while we're fighting, our users are leaving and our company is dying. Then what do you want to do? Sarah asked. I thought about Peter, about how he'd always been the loud one, the one who dominated conversations and commanded rooms. How I'd spent 36 years trying to be heard over him and failing. Let them talk, I said. Let the article stay up. Let people panic. Daniel and Sarah both stared at me. We'll release our complete security audit report. I continued. Every line of code, every data protection measure, every privacy policy. We'll make it public, available to anyone who wants to verify it. We'll release our financial records, showing we have zero revenue from insurance partnerships because we have zero insurance partnerships. We won't shout about it. We won't make demands. We'll just make the truth available and let people find it. That's not enough, Daniel said. People don't read audit reports, they read headlines. Some people do, journalists do, investigators do, the people who matter do. I looked at him. Truth doesn't need to shout, Daniel. It just needs to be available when people are ready to listen. We published everything the next day. A complete transparency report on our website. Security architecture, data handling procedures, privacy policies, financial statements, third-party audit, results. No press release, no dramatic announcement. Just information there for anyone who cared to look. The first 2 days, nothing changed. Users kept leaving. The news cycle moved on to other stories, but the damage remained. Then, on day 3, a technology security researcher named Marcus Webb published a thread analysing our transparency report. He walked through our code, verified our security measures, confirmed that we had no data selling infrastructure. His thread went viral in tech circles, and other security experts started examining our systems and corroborating his findings. On day 4, an investigative journalist at a competing publication started asking questions about Rebecca Chen's article. How had she verified her sources? Why hadn't she reached out to us for comment before publication? Where was the evidence? On day 5, someone leaked the payment records. $50,000 from Pinnacle Holdings, LLC, to Rebecca Chen's account dated 2 weeks after Peter's lawsuit was dismissed. The story exploded. But this time, we weren't the villains. Peter was. Rebecca Chen was fired from Tech Daily and issued a public apology. The original article was retracted with a prominent correction. News outlets that had run with the story published follow-ups about corporate sabotage, and journalistic ethics violations. Peter's reputation crumbled in ways the lawsuit never could. Business contacts distanced themselves. His company's board launched an investigation. The ethics board's inquiry into his lawsuit suddenly had new ammunition. Our users started coming back. Not all of them, but enough. And new users arrived, 2 women who'd heard about what happened and wanted to support a company that had been attacked for refusing to compromise on privacy. A week after we'd published the transparency report, Sarah sat in my apartment, both of us exhausted, but still standing. How did you stay so calm? She asked. When everything was falling apart, you just sat there and decided to release audit reports. I thought you'd lost it. I smiled, thinking about years of being talked over, dismissed, ignored by people who were louder, but not smarter, more confident, but not more capable. I learned something from my family, I said. The loudest voice isn't always the truest. And Peter just taught everyone else that lesson too. I learned something from my family. The loudest voice isn't always the truest. And Peter just taught everyone else that lesson too. But Peter, I should have remembered, never learned lessons. He only escalated. 3 weeks after the smear campaign fell apart, Sarah and I were in our new office. A real office now, not a coffee shop or apartment. Interviewing candidates for our engineering team. We'd hired 6 people already. We're planning to hire 10 more by year's end. The walls still smelled like fresh paint and half the desks were empty, but it felt real in a way nothing had before. Daniel called in the middle of an interview. I saw his name on my phone, sent it to voicemail, and continued talking to the candidate about database architecture. He called again immediately, then again. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. Daniel, I'm in the middle of... We have a problem. How fast can you get to my office? What kind of problem? The kind I need to show you in person. Bring Sarah. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in Daniel's office while he pulled up financial documents on his laptop. His expression was grim. Do you remember when we set up the shareholder structure? we kept 70% between you and Sarah, sold 30% to early investors to raise capital. Yes, I said. Small investments, lots of individual angel investors. We wanted to avoid giving any single person too much control. Right, well, someone's been quietly buying up those shares. Small purchases over the past 4 months, different buyers each time, nothing big enough to trigger disclosure requirements. Sarah leaned forward. How much have they bought? 28%. They're 3 percentage points away from being able to force a board meeting and propose changes to company structure. My stomach tightened. Who's buying? Daniel turned his laptop screen toward us. A fund called Pinnacle Ventures Capital Management. Delaware registered minimal public information, but I did some digging into their corporate structure. He pulled up another document. Pinnacle Ventures is a subsidiary of Hartwell Strategic Holdings, and guess who sits on Hartwell's advisory board? I already knew. Peter. Not just on the board. He's their senior strategic advisor, the role he took after the ethics inquiry made his VP position at Peters Inc. untenable. He gets paid in equity and has influence over investment decisions. Sarah was doing math in her head. If they buy 3 more percentage points, they'll have 31%. What can they do with that? Demand a board seat, propose changes to operating agreements, force votes on major decisions. And if they can convince just one of your other small investors to side with them, they could block your Series B funding, fire executives, restructure the company however they want. I sat back in my chair feeling something cold settle in my chest. The lawsuit had failed. The smear campaign had backfired. So Peter had been working on this for months, quietly buying shares through intermediaries, preparing a financial attack while we were distracted by legal and media battles. Can we stop them? I asked. Legally, not really. They're buying shares at fair market value from willing sellers. There's no fraud, no manipulation. They're just acquiring equity. Daniel paused. Unless what? He was looking at something on his screen, scrolling through what appeared to be our original shareholder agreement from 2 years ago. When we first structured the company, I added some protective provisions. Poison pill clauses, anti-takeover measures. You remember? Vaguely, you said we probably wouldn't need them. Right, because most startups don't have vindictive family members trying to destroy them. He kept scrolling. Here it is, Article 7, Section 3, the Anti-Dilution and Voting Rights Restriction Clause. He turned the laptop toward us, again pointing at dense legal language. This says that if any single shareholder or affiliated group of shareholders acquires more than 30% of company shares without explicit prior approval from the board of directors, those shares automatically convert to non-voting preferred stock. They still own the shares, they still get dividends if we ever pay them, but they lose all voting rights and board representation privileges. Sarah's eyes widened. So, if Pinnacle Ventures buys that last 3%, their entire stake becomes powerless for control purposes. All 28% they've already bought, plus whatever they buy next. It all converts automatically. I looked at Daniel. And Peter doesn't know about this clause? I doubt it. His lawyers probably reviewed our basic corporate structure before the lawsuit, but this is buried in Article 7 of a 50-page shareholder agreement. Most people don't read that far, and even if they do, they might not understand the implications. How much has he spent so far? I asked. Daniel pulled up another spreadsheet. Based on the share prices from each transaction, approximately $12 million. If he buys the remaining 3% at current valuations, he'll be in for another $3 million. $15 million total for shares that will give him zero control. Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. He's going to lose $15 million the moment he crosses 30%. Should we warn him? I asked. Daniel and Sarah both looked at me like I'd suggested setting our office on fire. Why would we warn him? Sarah said. I thought about it. about Peter firing me and calling me not strategic enough, about him using my social security number to steal $50,000, about the lawsuit, the smear campaign, my mother testifying against me in court, about 36 years of being dismissed and diminished and treated like I didn't matter. We shouldn't, I said. Let him buy the shares. Are you sure? Daniel asked. Because once this triggers, it's going to be very public. He'll know you knew about the clause that you let him walk into a trap. This isn't defense anymore. This is offense. I thought about that word. Offense. For 2 years, I'd been defending, protecting, surviving, building walls and hoping they'd hold. But maybe Daniel was right. Maybe it was time to stop just defending. I'm sure, I said. How do we know when they try to buy more shares? I've set up alerts on all your investor accounts. The moment someone makes an offer to buy shares from any of them, we'll know. The alert came 3 days later. Pinnacle Ventures had approached 5 of our small investors with generous offers enough above market value to make it very tempting. 3 of them had accepted already selling a combined 4% of the company. Daniel called me as the transactions were processing. They just crossed the threshold, 32% total ownership as of 10 minutes ago. The voting rights restriction clause activated automatically. What happens now? Legally nothing immediate, but Pinnacle Ventures will receive notification that their shares have converted to non-voting preferred stock. They'll try to challenge it, probably claim they didn't know about the clause, but it's ironclad. Courts consistently uphold these provisions. They knew they were buying into a company with existing governance structures. Due diligence was their responsibility. So, Peter just lost $15 million. More or less, he'll still own the shares, so if we ever sell the company or go public, he'll get his investment back plus appreciation. But in terms of control, in terms of being able to influence or damage the company, he has 0 power now. Less power than he had before he started buying. I sat in my office after Daniel hung up watching the sun set over the city through my window. Somewhere out there, Peter was probably just finding out what had happened. That the shares he'd spent months acquiring, the attack he'd been planning while fighting us on other fronts, had become worthless for his purposes the moment he'd succeeded. My phone rang again. Daniel. Peter's lawyers just filed an emergency motion claiming the voting rights restriction is unconscionable and should be invalidated. Will it work? No. These clauses are standard in corporate governance, especially for startups. The judge will throw it out probably within a week. But I wanted you to know he's already trying to fight it. Of course he is. Sarah came into my office an hour later with takeout. We ate in comfortable silence, both processing what had happened. You know what the craziest part is? Sidai? She said finally. He could have just left you alone. He'd already lost the lawsuit. The smear campaign had backfired. If he'd just walked away, he could have saved $15 million and whatever was left of his reputation. But that would have meant accepting that I'd won, I said. That I'd built something he couldn't destroy. Peter's never been able to accept being second to anyone, especially not to me. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Peter's emergency motion denied. Judge's order says corporate governance provisions must be respected. It's over. I showed Sarah the message. This calls for celebration, she said. But I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt tired and maybe a little sad. Not for Peter, who'd earned every consequence coming to him, but for the brother he could have been, the family we could have had if any of them had ever been able to see me as something other than a supporting character in Peter's story. That night I sat in my apartment with all the lights off, looking out at the city. I thought about the scared woman I'd been 2 years ago, fired and betrayed, sitting in a different apartment, wondering how to survive. I thought about signing partnership papers with Sarah, about learning to code about eating ramen and working 16-hour days and believing in something nobody else could see yet. I thought about Daniel adding that protection clause 2 years ago, never explaining exactly what it did, just trusting that we'd need it someday. And we had. I didn't celebrate. I just sat quietly and thought, this is what patience looks like. This is what they underestimated. Patience looks like sitting quietly and knowing what's coming while everyone else lives in yesterday's assumptions. 6 months after Peter lost $15 million trying to steal my company, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to care what my family thought. Almost, but not quite. Because when my mother called on the first Tuesday in April, I still felt that old pull, that muscle memory of obligation. Amanda, her voice on the phone was careful neutral. It's Easter dinner this Sunday. The family will be at my house. You should come. I could have said no, should have said no. I had a dozen legitimate reasons. We were closing final negotiations on our Series C funding. I had calls scheduled with institutional investors. My calendar was packed with meetings that actually mattered. But I also knew something she didn't. Forbes would publish their annual billionaire list on Monday morning. The business section would lead with surprise newcomers, and my name would be there with a profile about the health tech company that had quietly become a unicorn while fighting off attacks from my own family. For the family, my mother continued when I didn't respond immediately. The way she said it made it clear this wasn't about wanting to see me. This was about maintaining appearances, about being able to tell relatives that the family was intact, that the Lopez name still meant something whole and unified. "I'll be there," I said. She sounded surprised. "You will?" "Yes, Mum. What time?" This would be the last time they'd see me the old way. The last time I'd walk into that house as the disappointing daughter, the failed sister, the one who'd never measured up. Tomorrow, everything would be different. But tonight, for a few more hours, I could let them keep their comfortable illusions. Sunday arrived with perfect spring weather. I dressed simply nothing expensive or flashy. A plain navy dress, minimal jewellery, practical shoes. I looked exactly like what they expected. Competent but unremarkable professional, but not impressive, treeing but not quite succeeding. I drove to my mother's house the same route I'd driven 1,000 times growing up. The neighbourhood hadn't changed. Neither had the house with its manicured lawn and the rose bushes my father had planted 20 years ago. Cars lined the street. Peter's Mercedes, Uncle Carlos's truck, Aunt Teresa's SUV. The whole family was here. I parked and sat in my car for a moment looking at the house. In 24 hours, I'd be on the Forbes Billionaire List. In 24 hours, everyone in that house would know what I'd built while they thought I was failing. In 24 hours, my mother would have to reconcile the daughter she'd dismissed with the woman the world was starting to recognise. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, I was still invisible. I walked in without knocking. The house smelled like ham, and the perfume my mother always wore to family gatherings. Voices came from the living room, laughter and conversation. Peter saw me first. He was holding a glass of wine, wearing an expensive suit, even though this was just family dinner. He'd aged since I'd seen him last, new lines around his eyes, grey, creeping into his hair at the temples. The failed proxy takeover had cost him more than money. His reputation in business circles had taken a hit, and he'd been quietly removed from several advisory boards. "Amanda," he said, his tone neutral. Not warm, not hostile, just acknowledgement. "Peter." Still in the city. He nodded like this was fascinating. "How's the health app thing going?" "It's going well." Good. Keeping busy is important." He said it the way you'd talk to someone with a hobby, something that filled time but didn't really matter. Then he turned to Uncle Carlos and continued a story he'd been telling about his new house in Manhattan. I heard him mention the price. $8 million. The whole room made appreciative noises. My mother appeared from the kitchen, saw me, and her expression did that thing it always did. A flicker of disappointment, quickly covered by polite welcome. "Amanda, you came? You invited me. Well, come, help me in the kitchen." I followed her, and we worked in silence preparing dishes. She didn't ask about my life, didn't inquire about my work or whether I was happy, or what I'd been doing for the past 6 months. She just handed me tasks: arrange these vegetables, pour this sauce, set out these plates. Through the kitchen door, I could hear Peter talking about his business ventures, his investments, his connections. Every few minutes, someone would laugh or express admiration. He held the room the way he'd always held every room, confident and certain that his presence was the most important thing happening. After about 20 minutes, my mother pulled me aside near the pantry, her voice low. "Amanda, I hope you're learning from your brother. Look at him out there. Success isn't about trying hard or being good-hearted. It's about being smart, strategic, knowing how to build real wealth." She paused, studying my face. "Peter is smart. He understands how the world works. You have a good heart, but that's not enough in this world. A good heart doesn't buy houses or build legacies." I looked at my mother, this woman who'd spent my entire life telling me in 1,000 different ways that I wasn't enough, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not hurt, just a quiet certainty. "You're right, Mum," I said. "Tomorrow you'll see what enough really looks like." She frowned, not understanding. "What does that mean?" "It means I learned more than you think." Before she could respond, someone called from the living room that dinner was ready. We all gathered around the same table where 3 years ago my mother had told me I'd never be as successful as my brother. The same chairs, the same relatives, the same patterns of conversation. Peter sat at one head of the table, my mother at the other. I was somewhere in the middle next to Aunt Teresa, who asked polite questions about whether I was seeing anyone and when I planned to settle down. Someone asked me directly, loud enough for the table to hear, "Amanda, how about you still doing that health app thing?" Everyone turned to look. Peter was smiling, that patronising smile that said he was interested the way you'd be interested in a child's art project. "Yes," I said, smiling back. "Still doing that little project." "That's nice that you found something to keep you busy," Aunt Teresa said. "It's important to have hobbies." Peter laughed, not unkindly, just amused. "At least she's keeping busy, that's what matters." My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out discreetly under the table. "A message from Forbes, Ms. Lopez, we'd like to interview you for our upcoming Women in Tech feature. Can we schedule a call this week?" I turned off my phone and set it aside, smiling to myself. "What was that?" Peter asked. "Everything okay?" "Just a work thing." He smirked, exchanging a glance with one of his friends from the company. "Women in Tech feature. That's cute. Those features profile hundreds of small founders. Good PR for startups trying to get noticed." "Probably," I agreed. The dinner continued. Ham was served, wine was poured, and conversations flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream, something to move around rather than engage with. Peter dominated the discussion, talking about real estate investments and market trends and connections with people whose names were supposed to impress. I ate quietly, responding when spoken to, but mostly just observing. Looking at these people I'd known my entire life, these people who'd never really seen me, and knowing that in less than 24 hours everything would be different. At one point, my mother caught my eye from across the table. She looked satisfied, like having the whole family together maintaining the appearance of unity was a success in itself. I thought about the Forbes list that would be published in the morning, about the profile that would detail how I built a company, now valued at 2.8 billion, about the interviews that would inevitably follow, the questions about overcoming adversity and building success despite family opposition. Tomorrow, my mother would wake up to phone calls from relatives who'd seen the news. Tomorrow, Peter would learn that the sister he'd tried to destroy was now worth more than he'd ever be. Tomorrow, everyone at this table would have to reconcile their assumptions with reality. But tonight, they could keep their comfortable lies. Tonight, I could sit here, invisible one last time, the disappointing daughter at the family table, the sister who never quite measured up. As we sat down for dinner, I looked around the table one last time. They had no idea. By morning, everything would change. As we sat down for dinner, I looked around the table one last time. They had no idea. By morning, everything would change. I barely slept that night in my old bedroom, the one I'd grown up in with the same pale yellow walls and the same view of the backyard. Not because I was nervous, because I was ready. I heard my mother moving around the house at 6 a.m, starting preparations for Easter breakfast. This was her tradition, the thing she did every year, a big family breakfast on Easter morning, with homemade cinnamon rolls and a ham and cheese casserole that had been her mother's recipe. I got up dressed in jeans and a simple sweater and went downstairs. She looked surprised to see me in the kitchen. "You're up early?" "Couldn't sleep." She nodded, not particularly interested, and handed me a bowl. "You can whisk the eggs." We worked in silence the same way we'd worked the night before. Through the doorway, I could see into the living room where the TV was on, showing CNBC's morning business news. The sound was low, just background noise while the house slowly came alive. Peter came downstairs around 7, already showered and dressed like he was going to a business meeting. His daughter, Emma, and her husband arrived shortly after bringing pastries from an expensive bakery. Uncle Carlos and Aunt Teresa showed up with their kids. By 7:30, the house was full of people and noise and the smell of cinnamon and coffee. Everyone gathered in the living room and dining room, plates in hand, conversations overlapping. Peter held court near the TV, telling a story about a business deal he was working on. Emma was showing my mother photos on her phone of a vacation they were planning. I sat on the couch with a plate of food I wasn't eating, watching the TV that no one else was really watching. The CNBC anchor was going through financial news, market updates, corporate earnings. Then, at exactly 7:45, she said the words I'd been waiting for. "And now, the newly released Forbes Billionaire List for 2024. We're going to break down some of the surprise additions and notable changes from last year." Peter's head turned toward the TV. "Oh, this is interesting." He settled into a chair, suddenly paying attention. "Wonder if I'll make it to the under 40 list next year. My financial advisor thinks I'm close." A few people chuckled politely. My mother smiled at him with that look of pride she reserved only for her son. The anchor continued reading from her notes. "The big story this year is the number of newcomers in the tech sector, particularly in health technology. Traditional tech hubs are being challenged by innovations in biotech and healthcare services." Peter nodded knowingly. "That's where the money is now, healthcare data." "One surprise addition," the anchor said, "is a relatively unknown founder who's been building her company quietly over the past 3 years. Amanda Lopez, 38, founder and CEO of Lopez Legacy Systems, formerly known as Wellher." The room didn't immediately go quiet. A few people were still talking, not paying attention. But I saw Peter's body go rigid, his head snapped toward the screen. The anchor kept reading. "The health tech platform that helps women over 40 track menopause and other health concerns has been valued at $2.2 billion after a Series C funding round led by Sequoia Capital announced this morning. This makes Lopez the youngest Latina self-made billionaire in the tech sector and places her at number 847 on the global billionaire list." My mother's coffee cup slipped from her hand. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered coffee spreading across the wood in a dark stain. But she didn't look down. She was staring at the TV screen, which now showed a photo of me. It was a professional photo from our company website taken in our office 6 months ago. I was standing in front of a glass wall with the Lopez Legacy Systems logo behind me, smiling confidently. I looked nothing like the daughter she knew. I looked like someone who'd built something that mattered. The room went completely silent. Emma grabbed her phone, typing frantically. Then she screamed, an actual scream that made several people jump. "Oh my God, that's Aunt Amanda. Aunt Amanda is on the Forbes Billionaire List." All eyes turned to me. I sat there on the couch, my plate of untouched food beside me, and met their stares calmly. Peter stood up slowly, his face cycling through emotions, confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally, something that might have been panic. "That can't be right. Amanda's company is small, it's barely viable." "Apparently not," Uncle Carlos said, staring at his own phone, now pulling up articles. It says here she has 1.5 million users, Series C funding, Sequoia Capital, that's real money. My mother hadn't moved. She was still staring at the TV, even though they'd moved on to other news. Her face had gone pale, her mouth slightly open like she was trying to process information that didn't fit into any framework she had for understanding the world. I set down my plate and stood up. The room watched me silent, waiting for an explanation or an apology, or something that would make this make sense. I looked at my mother first, just looked at her letting the moment stretch. Then, I spoke, my voice quiet but clear. You once told me I'd never be as successful as my brother. My mother's eyes finally focused on me, and I saw something in them I'd never seen before. Fear. You were right, Mom. I didn't become like him. Peter made a sound, maybe a protest, but I kept talking. I became something else. I became someone who builds instead of takes, someone who lifts others instead of stepping on them, someone who creates value instead of extracting it. I paused, letting that sink in. And yes, I became a billionaire doing it. But the number doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. Then, what matters? My mother asked, her voice barely a whisper. What matters is that I did it my way, with my name, with my values. I spent 36 years trying to be enough for this family, trying to earn love that was never going to be given, trying to fit into a role that was designed to keep me small. I looked at Peter, who was still standing there frozen. You sued me. You tried to smear my reputation. You tried to steal my company. And every time I survived, not because I fought back the way you fight, loud and aggressive and destructive, but because I built something you couldn't destroy, something real. I looked around the room at all of them, these people I'd known my entire life, who'd never really known me at all. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt. I'm just done. Done trying to make you see me. Done waiting for approval that will never come. Done being the supporting character in Peter's story. My mother started crying, tears running down her face, but she didn't speak. Peter found his voice finally. You lied to us. You let us think you were struggling when you were building a billion-dollar company. You made us look like fools. No, I said simply. You made yourselves look like fools. I just stopped trying to manage your perceptions. I picked up my purse from the couch and walked toward the door. The room parted for me, people stepping back like I was someone they didn't recognize. At the doorway, I turned back one last time. I hope you build a life you're proud of, Peter. Not one designed to prove you're better than someone else, but one that actually matters. And Mum, I hope someday you figure out why you needed me to be small, because it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with you. My mother was sobbing now, Uncle Carlos trying to comfort her, but the sound followed me out of the house. I walked to my car, got in and sat there for a moment. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. Through the window, I could see the house people moving around inside, probably arguing, or trying to process what had just happened. My phone was buzzing with messages, but I ignored it. I started the car and drove away from that house, that family, that version of myself that had tried so hard for so long to be enough for people who would never think she was. As I walked out, I heard my niece whisper, Mom, Aunt Amanda is a billionaire. And my mum finally had no words. As I walked out, I heard my niece whisper, Mom, Aunt Amanda is a billionaire. And my mum finally had no words. I drove back to the city with the windows down, spring air rushing through the car, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. The phone in my purse was buzzing continuously, but I ignored it. Whatever was happening out there in the world could wait 30 minutes. When I got to my apartment, I finally looked at my phone. 347 notifications. Text messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Emails from journalists, from former colleagues, from investment firms. voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize, and one text from Sarah sent 20 minutes ago. "Where are you? The internet is losing its mind. Call me." I called her. She answered immediately. "Are you okay? Are you safe? What happened?" "I'm fine. I'm home. What's going on?" "What's going on?" "Amanda, you're trending worldwide. The Forbes announcement went viral. Like, actually viral. Not tech world viral. Everywhere viral." I opened my laptop and saw what she meant. The story had exploded beyond business news into mainstream media. CNN had picked it up. BBC, major news outlets across multiple countries. But it wasn't just the billionaire angle they were covering. Someone had dug up the court records from Peter's lawsuit. Someone else had found the articles about the smear campaign. Journalists were connecting the dots, and the narrative was no longer just about a successful founder. It was about a woman who'd built a billion-dollar company while her own brother tried to destroy her. Twitter had a hashtag, #I am Amanda Lopez. I clicked on it and watched the tweets scroll past hundreds every minute. Women sharing stories about being overlooked by their families, about sacrificing their dreams for brothers or sons, about being told they weren't enough, weren't smart enough, weren't ambitious enough. I was told to stop playing with computers and help my brother with his real career. Today, I'm a software engineer at Microsoft and he's unemployed. My parents paid for my brother's law school while I worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college. Now I own my own business and he calls asking for loans. My mother told me I'd never be anything. Yesterday, I defended my PhD dissertation. This is for every daughter who was told to be smaller. The stories kept coming, thousands of them, and I sat there reading until my eyes burned. "Amanda, are you there?" Sarah's voice brought me back. "Yeah, I'm here. This is crazy. Every major publication wants to interview you. Forbes wants a cover story. TechCrunch wired the New York Times. Even Good Morning America called. Tell them no. Amanda, tell them all no. I don't want to do interviews. I don't want to tell my story over and over. I built a company that helps women. That's the story, the company, not my family drama." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Okay, but you have to say something. People are waiting to hear from you." I thought about it, about all those women sharing their stories, about feeling seen in a way they hadn't before. I opened Instagram, found the photo I'd taken weeks ago, and saved but never posted. It was the hand-knitted scarf from that first Christmas dinner, the one my mother had set aside without a second glance. I'd kept it all these years folded, carefully in a drawer, a reminder of what it felt like to be invisible. I posted the photo with the simple caption, "Some gifts are never valued until the giver is." I turned off my phone after that and sat in my quiet apartment watching the sun move across the floor. The consequences I learned over the next few days were more severe than even I'd anticipated. Peter's Inkl's board called an emergency meeting Monday morning. The story about Peter's attempts to destroy his sister's company had reached shareholders, and they were furious. Not just about the ethical implications, but about the financial ones. Peter had cost the company $15 million in a failed proxy takeover. He'd exposed them to legal liability with the lawsuit and the email hacking. The smear campaign had involved company resources and potentially company funds. The board demanded his resignation. When he refused, they voted him out. The stock dropped 23% in 2 days. My mother called me Tuesday evening. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Amanda!" Her voice was broken raw from crying. "Please, you have to help your brother." "Mum." "His career is falling apart. The board fired him. Companies are cancelling contracts. He's losing everything. You have influence now. You can make calls, tell people this was all a misunderstanding, help him recover." I closed my eyes, feeling that old pull, that old programming that said family helps family, that said good daughters sacrifice. He made his choices, Mom. But he's your brother. He's family. He sued me. He tried to steal my company. He paid someone to publish lies about me. These aren't misunderstandings. These are choices, actions with consequences. But you're succeeding. You have everything now. Can't you be generous? Can't you help him? The word generous hung in the air between us, as if Peter deserved my generosity, as if I owed him anything after everything he'd done. Mom, do you remember what you told me when I was in the hospital with you, when I asked why you'd testified against me in court? She was quiet. You said, don't make things difficult for him. That was your advice, your philosophy. Protect Peter even at my expense. Well, I'm following that advice. I'm not making things difficult for him. I'm just not making them easier. He created this situation. He can find his way out of it. You've become so cold, she whispered. No, Mum. I've become free. There's a difference. I paused, choosing my words carefully. You taught me that love meant making myself smaller so others could be bigger. That being a good daughter meant sacrificing my dreams for my brother's success. You taught me that my value was in how useful I was, not in who I was. And I learned those lessons really well. Too well. It took me 36 years to unlearn them. I never meant to hurt you. I know. But you did, and you kept doing it over and over because it was easier than examining why you needed me to fail so Peter could succeed. I felt tears on my cheeks, but my voice stayed steady. I love you, Mum, but I can't save Peter from himself, and I won't destroy what I've built to make his failure easier to accept. She hung up without saying goodbye. Wednesday afternoon, a young woman appeared in our office lobby asking to see me. The receptionist called up, uncertain. She says her name is Lena Martinez, and that she used to work for your brother. She says you'll want to hear what she has to say. I remembered the name. Lena had been Peter's senior assistant for 3 years, the one who managed his schedule, prepared his presentations, knew everything about his business operations. I told the receptionist to send her up. Lena was maybe 28, professionally dressed with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping. She sat across from my desk, hands folded in her lap, and looked at me with something like determination mixed with fear. Ms. Lopez, I don't know if you remember me. I remember you. I need to tell you something. I was the one who leaked the proxy takeover plan to your lawyer, Daniel Rivera. I sat back in my chair processing this. Why? Because Peter asked me to do things I couldn't do anymore. He wanted me to falsify documents to make the proxy takeover look legitimate. He asked me to spy on competitors to access confidential information. He wanted me to help him destroy you. And when I saw the emails, when I saw what he was planning, she stopped, swallowed hard. I saw what he did to you, how he talked about you when you weren't there, how he'd smile to your face and then plot behind your back. And I realized that if I kept helping him, I'd become like him. Someone who hurts people and justifies it as business. So you went to Daniel. I sent him anonymous information first, the proxy takeover plan, the shell company structure. He figured out the rest. She looked down at her hands. I lost my job over it. Peter figured out I was the leak after the takeover failed. He didn't press charges because he couldn't without admitting what he'd tried to do. But I've been blacklisted. No one in his network will hire me. I studied her for a long moment. Why did you come here? Because I wanted you to know that not everyone in his orbit was like him. Some of us saw what he was doing and chose differently. She stood up. I should go. I just needed you to know that. Wait, I stood too. I'm starting a foundation, Lopez Legacy Foundation. We're going to help women over 40 who want to start businesses but don't have resources or support. We're going to need someone to run day-to-day operations. Someone who understands corporate structure and ethics and what it means to choose principles over profit. Lena's eyes widened. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to be part of something that matters. Interested? She nodded, unable to speak. Good. Talk to Sarah Chen downstairs about the details. We launch in 2 months. After she left, I sat at my desk looking out the window at the city. My phone buzzed with another call from a news outlet. I ignored it. Sarah appeared in my doorway. That was a good thing you just did. She made a hard choice. She deserves a second chance. Sarah leaned against the doorframe. So, do you feel victorious? After everything, after the Forbes announcement and Peter losing his job and all of it, does it feel like you won? I thought about that for a long moment, about my mother crying on the phone, about Peter's career in ruins, about 3 years of fighting and surviving and building something that mattered. No, I said finally, I don't feel victorious. I feel free. And that's better than any revenge. 2 weeks later, my receptionist called up to my office with uncertainty in her voice. Ms. Lopez, there's a Maria Lopez here to see you. She says she's your mother. She doesn't have an appointment. I looked at my calendar. I had a meeting with potential foundation board members in 30 minutes. Send her up. My mother walked into my office like she was entering foreign territory, looking around at the glass walls, the modern furniture, the Lopez Legacy Systems logo, visible through the window behind my desk. She'd aged since Easter new lines around her eyes, her shoulders slightly hunched in a way I'd never seen before. Amanda. Her voice cracked on my name. Mum, sit down. She sat in the chair across from my desk, and I saw her hands shaking. She was crying before she even started talking. The CCT is investigating Peter for the email hacking. They're looking into the identity theft too. His lawyers say they might press criminal charges. Federal charges, Amanda. He could go to prison. I waited, knowing there was more. You have influence now. You're on television and magazines. People know your name. You could make calls. You could tell them this was a family misunderstanding, that you don't want to press charges, that it wasn't as bad as it looks. You could help him. No, I can't. Please. She was sobbing now. He's your brother. Family helps family. Something in me snapped, not with anger, but with clarity so sharp it hurt. I helped him for 15 years, Mum. I gave up Stanford for him. I gave him my savings. I co-signed his loans. I let him use my credit, my name, my identity. What did he give me $50,000 in fraudulent debt? A lawsuit, public humiliation, attempts to destroy everything I built. But he's suffering now. So was I. My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. For years I suffered. But you never noticed. You never asked if I was okay. You never wondered if maybe your good daughter was drowning while you celebrated your son. You only ask now because his pain is visible and mine was silent. My mother wiped her eyes, mascara running down her cheeks. What do you want me to say? That I was a bad mother, that I failed you? Fine, I failed you. But does that mean you should let your brother go to prison? I stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the city. When I spoke, my voice was steady again. I love you, Mum, I do. But I can't save someone who refuses to save himself. Peter made choices. He chose to commit identity theft. He chose to file a fraudulent lawsuit. He chose to hack my email to pay for smear campaigns to try to steal my company. These aren't mistakes. They're crimes. And if the SEC is investigating him, it's because he broke laws. But you could make it stop. No, I can't. And I won't try. That's not cruelty. That's justice. And maybe it's the only way he'll ever learn that actions have consequences. My mother stood, her face hardening. You've become so cold, just like your father was at the end. She walked out before I could respond, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there in my empty office, that last sentence echoing in my mind. Just like your father was at the end. What did she mean? What didn't I know about him? 3 days later, Peter answered that question in the worst possible way. He called a press conference, not a quiet legal filing, not a private family matter, but a full media event with cameras and reporters and his lawyers standing behind him in expensive suits. I watched it live-streamed on my computer, Daniel, on speakerphone, both of us silent as Peter spoke to the cameras. I've struggled with whether to make this public, he began, his voice measured and sad. But recent events have forced my hand. While cleaning out my father's storage unit before the lease expired, I found a safety deposit box key. Inside was a will dated 6 months before his death, properly witnessed and notarized. He held up a document for the cameras. My father, Carlos Lopez, left specific instructions. He wrote, "I leave all family business assets and the Lopez name rights to my son Peter. My daughter, Amanda, receives my love but not my legacy. She was never built for this world. She is too emotional, too easily swayed, too soft for the demands of real business." The words hit me like physical blows. Too emotional, too soft, never built for this world. Peter continued his performance flawless. I didn't want to reveal this, but my father knew Amanda's limitations. He wanted to protect the family name, to ensure the Lopez legacy went to someone who could carry it forward with strength and strategic vision. Daniel was saying something on the phone, but I couldn't hear him over the ringing in my ears. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Did Amanda Lopez build her empire on stolen family legacy? Father's will suggests billionaire founder wasn't meant for business. Family documents challenge Lopez's success story. My investors called old emergency meetings. Social media exploded with speculation. Some people defended me, but others questioned everything. Had I stolen ideas from family discussions? Had I built my company on my father's business insights? Was my success legitimate? I stopped reading after the first dozen articles. I turned off my phone. I locked my apartment door. Sarah came by the next day, knocking repeatedly. "Amanda, let me in. We need to figure this out. Daniel has a plan." I didn't answer. She came back the day after. "Amanda, please, talk to me. This is Peter being Peter. We'll fight it. We always do." But I couldn't fight anymore, because this wasn't about business or money or even Peter. This was about my father, the man I'd barely known, apparently leaving a document that said in writing what I'd always feared, that I wasn't enough. That I'd never been enough. That even building a billion-dollar company couldn't change the fundamental truth that I was too soft, too emotional, too weak for this world. On the third day, Sarah used the spare key I'd given her months ago and let herself in. She found me in bed, curtains drawn, surrounded by tissues, and the photo I kept of my father. "Amanda." She sat on the edge of the bed. "Talk to me." "What if it's true?" My voice was raw from crying. What if I was never meant to be enough? What if everything I did was just me running from that truth? What if Dad really thought I was weak and I spent 3 years proving him right by needing to prove him wrong? You don't believe that, don't I? I looked at her. Why else would he write that 6 months before he died? That was his final assessment of me, his daughter. Too emotional, too soft, not built for this world. Maybe he was right. Maybe I've just been pretending. Sarah grabbed my shoulders. Listen to me. That document is probably fake, just like everything else Peter's tried. But even if it's real, even if your father wrote those words, it doesn't matter. Because you built something anyway. You proved him wrong. You proved all of them wrong. But I couldn't hear her. All I could hear was my father's voice in my head saying words he'd never said to my face, but apparently wrote on paper she was never built for this world. I looked at my father's photo on the shelf, the one from my college graduation he never attended. Did you really think I wasn't enough? Dad, or did I never really know you at all? Sarah had just convinced me to drink some water when the knocking started. Firm, persistent, the kind of knocking that said whoever was out there wasn't leaving. "I'll get it," Sarah said, standing up from the bed. I heard her open the door, heard a woman's voice I didn't recognize, older, speaking with an accent that reminded me of my grandmother. Then Sarah was back in the bedroom doorway. "Amanda, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your aunt." Clara. The name pulled me out of my fog. Aunt Clara, my mother's older sister, the one who'd stayed in Mexico when my mother immigrated. I'd met her maybe 3 times in my entire life, always briefly, at family events when she'd visit. I sat up slowly. "What's she doing here?" "She says she flew in from Mexico City after she heard about the will. She says she needs to talk to you." Aunt Clara stood in my living room looking exactly as I remembered, but older, her silver hair pulled back, wearing a simple dress and sensible shoes. She had my mother's eyes, but without the disappointment that always lived in them. "Mija," she said when she saw me, "you look terrible." Despite everything, I almost smiled. "Thanks. I came because I need to tell you something. Something your mother should have told you years ago but couldn't. And something your father couldn't say before he died, though he tried." I sat on the couch, Sarah beside me. Aunt Clara took the chair across from us, her hands folded in her lap like she was about to tell a story she'd been carrying for too long. "Your mother was the smartest girl in our village," she began. "While I was getting married at 17, your mother was drawing designs, planning a fashion studio in Mexico City. She had real talent, Amanda. She made sketches of dresses that would have been beautiful. She saved money from selling embroidered items at the market. She had a plan." I'd never heard this story, never knew my mother had wanted anything beyond being a wife and mother. But our father said no. Girls don't need education, they need husbands. He arranged her marriage to your father when she was 19. Carlos was a good man, traditional but kind. He loved her, but he didn't believe in her dreams. Aunt Clara's voice was steady but sad. "When they came to America and got settled, your mother tried to open a small sewing shop, just alterations and custom pieces. She was so excited, but your father said, 'We don't need the money. I provide for this family. You take care of the home.' And because she'd been raised to obey, she put away her designs and never mentioned them again. Every day after that, I watched a part of her die." I felt tears on my face, but didn't wipe them away. "Your mother sees herself in you, Mija. Your strength, your ambition, your refusal to give up, it terrifies her. Because you're everything she wanted to be but couldn't become. And when you succeed where she failed, it makes her entire life feel like it was wasted. Like maybe, if she'd been stronger, braver, she could have had what you have. So she pushed me down to feel better about herself." My voice was bitter. "No, she pushed you down because watching you rise was too painful. It's not fair. It's not right. But it's not really about you. It never was. It's about her own grief over a life she never got to live." Aunt Clara stood preparing to leave. "Your father understood this eventually. Too late, but he understood. Before he died, he told me he'd made a mistake, that he'd been scared of your mother's dreams because they made him feel inadequate, that he'd done the same thing to you that had been done to her." She walked to the door, then turned back. "Your father's workshop, the one behind your mother's house. Go there. He left something for you, something he couldn't say while he was alive. It's time you knew the truth." Sarah offered to come with me, but I shook my head. Whatever my father had left, whatever truth was waiting in that workshop, I needed to face it alone. The drive to my childhood home felt both familiar and foreign, like visiting a place you once knew in a dream. My mother's car wasn't in the driveway, which felt like a small mercy. I wasn't ready to see her yet to reconcile Aunt Clara's story with the woman who'd spent my whole life making me feel insufficient. The workshop was exactly where it had always been, a small structure behind the main house, separated by the garden my father used to tend. I hadn't been back here since his funeral, 10 years ago, had actively avoided it during the few times I'd visited my mother over the years. The door stuck when I tried to open it, wood-swollen from years of weather and neglect. I had to put my shoulder into it before it finally gave way, with a groan that sounded like an exhale, like the building itself had been holding its breath. Inside, everything was covered in a decade's worth of dust. The workbench where my father had built furniture, his tools still hanging on the wall in careful order, the half-finished chair he'd been making when he died. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, illuminating dust motes that floated in the still air. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw it, a small wooden box on a high shelf, the kind of box my father used to make as gifts. This one had my name carved into the lid in his careful script, Amanda. I pulled it down, surprised by its weight. The latch was locked with an old padlock, but the key was taped to the bottom. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were things I'd never seen before. Sketches on yellowed paper, dozens of them. Drawings of dresses with notes in Spanish in handwriting I recognized as my mother's. Fabric samples pinned to cardboard. A business plan written in careful English for a shop called Clara's and Maria's Studio. My mother's dreams preserved and hidden. And underneath it all, a letter. Handwritten, addressed to Maria, but never sent. I sat on my father's dusty workbench and read, "Maria, I found these drawings you hid under our bed. I never knew you still dreamed about this. I was wrong to tell you to stop. I was scared you'd succeed and realize you didn't need me. Scared you'd leave. I was a coward. By the time I understood, it was too late. You'd already stopped dreaming. Your eyes had gone dim. Our daughter, Amanda, she has your fire. The fire I extinguished in you. Please, Maria, don't do to her what I did to you. Let her fly, even if it means she flies away from us. She's everything you could have been if I had believed in you. I'm sorry I didn't. I hope she forgives us both. But more than that, I hope you forgive yourself. Carlos." The letter blurred as tears fell onto the paper. I read it again then, a third time, my father's words, rearranging everything I'd believed about my family, about myself, about why my mother had spent 38 years trying to keep me small. She wasn't evil. She was drowning in regret for a life she'd never lived, and watching me succeed felt like proof of everything she'd lost. And my father, he'd understood too late what he'd done to her, what they were both doing to me. The fake wall Peter had produced didn't matter anymore. Even if it was real, even if my father had written those words about me being too emotional, too soft, this letter was his truth. Written in private, meant for my mother, this was what he really believed. I held that letter like a lifeline, understanding finally what I'd been chasing all these years. Maybe I wasn't chasing success at all. Maybe I was chasing the words Dad never said out loud, "I believe in you." When Sarah called to tell me my mother had collapsed, I didn't think. I just grabbed the wooden box and drove to the hospital. The same hospital where I'd sat with her after her first heart attack. The same room where she'd asked for Peter and barely noticed I was there. This time felt different. This time I understood what I was walking into. She was in a private room, hooked up to monitors, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. Her hair was loose grey against the white pillow, and her eyes were closed. For a moment I thought she was asleep, but then I saw her hand clench the blanket, and I knew she was awake, just refusing to look at me. I pulled a chair close to the bed and set the wooden box on the table beside me. "Mum," I said softly, "I found Dad's workshop. I found what he left for me." Her eyes opened, but she still wouldn't look directly at me. "I don't want to talk about your father." "I think we need to." I opened the box and pulled out the sketches, laying them gently on the blanket that covered her. "Dad kept these. Your designs. Your dreams." Her hand trembled as she reached for the papers, tears immediately falling. "Where did you find these? I thought I'd thrown them all away." "Dad kept them. He wrote you a letter." I handed her the folded pages. "He never sent it, but I think you need to read it now." She took the letter with shaking hands, read it slowly, and by the end, she was sobbing. Not the quiet, dignified crying I'd seen from her before, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and wounded. "He was scared," I said gently. "He told you to give up your dreams because he was afraid you'd realize you didn't need him. And then he regretted it. But by then it was too late." "I was so young," she whispered. "I thought if I became the perfect wife, the perfect mother, he'd love me. I thought if I did everything right, I'd be happy, but I'd lost myself, and then you came along, so strong, so fearless, and I hated it." The words hurt, but I'd expected them. I hated it, because you were everything I couldn't be, everything I'd given up. Every time you succeeded, it felt like proof that I'd wasted my life, that if I'd just been braver, stronger, I could have had what you have. You didn't hate me, Mum. You hated what you saw in the mirror, the woman who gave up her dreams. But that fear, that regret, it doesn't have to pass to me. I won't carry it anymore. The cycle ends here, with me. She looked at me finally, really looked at me. I'm 68 years old. It's too late for me. It's never too late to stop being afraid. You can still dream, Mum. Maybe not fashion design, but something. And even if you can't, at least let me dream for both of us. Let my success be a tribute to what you could have been, not a reminder of what you weren't. Her hand found mine, gripping it tightly. I'm proud of you. I should have said it 30 years ago, but I'm saying it now. You are everything I wanted to be. Everything I was too scared to become. I'm sorry I made you feel small. You were never small. I was just too broken to see it. I leaned forward and embraced her, both of us, crying, her thin arms around me in a way they'd never been before. Not the hug of obligation or a greeting, but something real and raw and honest. "I forgive you," I whispered into her hair. "Not because you asked, but because I choose to, because carrying that pain doesn't serve either of us anymore." She held me tighter. "Your father's will, the one Peter showed, it's fake, isn't it?" "Yes, Daniel's proving it. But even if it wasn't, it wouldn't matter. Dad's real truth is in that letter. Everything else is just noise." We sat like that for a long time, the afternoon sun streaming through the hospital window, warming the room. Outside, the world continued its chaos. Peter fighting his battles, the media churning stories. But in that room, something old and poisonous was finally dying, and something new was taking its first fragile breath. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean what she did was okay. It means choosing peace over pain. Choosing to break the chain so it doesn't wrap around the next generation. Choosing freedom over the weight of carrying wounds that were never mine to begin with. Daniel called on a Tuesday morning, his voice containing something I couldn't quite identify. Excitement, maybe? Or relief. "RD wants to meet you, officially, in person, today, if possible." After 2 years of anonymous investment, careful guidance through intermediaries, and strategic support that had helped save my company, more than once the mysterious RD was finally ready to reveal himself. We met at the same small cafe where Sarah and I had reconnected 3 years ago, the place where this whole journey had really begun. I arrived, first ordered coffee I didn't drink, and waited. The man who walked in was in his mid-60s, distinguished in the way of people who lived full lives with integrity. Silver hair, kind eyes, a face that seemed vaguely familiar in a way I couldn't place. "Amanda Lopez," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Roberto Diaz. I was your father's best friend." The familiarity clicked into place. I'd seen him at my father's funeral 10 years ago, standing at the back, leaving before I could speak to him. "You're RD," I said. "I am. Your father asked me to watch over you after he died. Not to interfere, not to guide your choices, just to watch. To be there if you ever needed help you couldn't ask for." He sat down across from me. "When your lawyer sent me your business plan 2 years ago, looking for investors. I knew you were ready. That's when I decided to help. Why anonymously? Because you needed to build this yourself. If you'd known your father's friend was funding you, you might have doubted your own abilities. You might have thought you only succeeded because someone gave you charity. He smiled. You needed to know you did this on your own. And you did. Roberto pulled an envelope from his jacket, sealed with wax, clearly old. Your father gave me this 10 years ago, 3 days before he died. He said, if Peter ever tries to take what's Amanda's, give her this. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a will properly notarized with 2 witness signatures I recognized as family friends. The date was 1 week before my father's death. I leave the Lopez name and all moral rights to my business legacy to my daughter, Amanda Lopez. She carries the values this family was built on: integrity, hard work, and lifting others up. My son will inherit money, but my daughter will inherit character. And in the end, character is the only wealth that lasts. I read it 3 times, tears blurring the words. Your father knew Peter's nature, Roberto said quietly. He loved his son, but he wasn't blind. He knew that if anything valuable was at stake, Peter would try to take it. So he made sure I had this hidden away, waiting for the moment it would be needed. Peter's will was fake, I said. Completely fabricated. Daniel's already proven it. The notary whose stamp was used died 5 years before the will was supposedly created. The witnesses don't exist. It was sloppy work done by someone desperate. Daniel filed the real will with the court that afternoon. By evening, Peter was charged with felony forgery and document fraud. The penalties were immediate: a $500,000 fine, a ban from serving as a corporate officer for 5 years, and a 2-year suspended sentence contingent on his staying out of legal trouble. My mother called that night. Not crying this time, not pleading. Just quiet. I saw the news, she said. About the real will, about Peter. Yes. I'm not going to ask you to help him. I'm not going to tell you family comes first. I'm just calling to say I'm sorry for everything, for not seeing you, for not protecting you, for letting my fear become your burden. Her voice broke slightly. I see it now. I see you now. I know, Mum, I said and meant it. I know. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, holding both documents, my father's letter to my mother and his will, leaving me his moral legacy. 2 pieces of paper that said what he'd never been able to say to my face. I see you. I believe in you. You are enough. I looked at his photo on my shelf and whispered, You believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I won't let you down. I promise. The promise I made to my father became the foundation for everything that came next. 2 months after the real will was authenticated, I stood in a renovated warehouse space in downtown with Sarah Lena and Aunt Clara looking at the sign being installed above the entrance Lopez Legacy Foundation. Your father would be proud, Aunt Clara said, squeezing my hand. The foundation's mission was simple: empowering women over 40 who were told they're too late, too old, too much, or not enough. We would provide startup capital, business, mentorship, legal services, and a community of support for women who wanted to build something but had been told their time had passed. Lena had been working with me for weeks to structure it properly. She'd left Peter's company with nothing but her integrity, and now she was building something that would help thousands of other women make similarly brave choices. I want to be executive director, she'd said when I first proposed the foundation, not because I need a job, but because I know what it's like to work for someone who makes you feel small. I want to help build something that makes women feel seen. Sarah designed the technology platform, a hub where women could access resources, connect with mentors, apply for grants, and share their stories. It launched in September, and within the first month, we had 50,000 applications from women across the country. Aunt Clara became our ambassador, traveling to community centres and libraries, sharing her story and my mother's story, talking about generations of women who'd been told to be quiet and small. At 70, she was more energised than I'd ever seen her. I spent 50 years being quiet, she told audiences. Now I get to be loud for all of us. The first year we helped 10,000 women start businesses, bakeries and consulting firms, online stores and therapy practices, art studios and coding boot camps. The I Am Amanda Lopez hashtag, which had started as Women Sharing Pain, transformed into Women Sharing Success. A message came through the foundation's website one evening from a woman named Patricia Chen in Oregon. I'm 55. My family told me I was too old to start over after my divorce. Today, I opened my bakery. I used your foundation's grant and mentorship program. This morning, a line of customers stretched around the block. Thank you, Amanda. You made me believe it wasn't too late. I read it 3 times, then closed my laptop and cried. Not from sadness, but from understanding what real success felt like. Not the Forbes list or the billion-dollar valuation. This, knowing that my pain had become someone else's permission to try. The movement spread globally. Women in Japan started their own version of the hashtag. In Mexico, Aunt Clara's story inspired a documentary. In India, a group of women over 50 started a collective business using our model. In Kenya, grandmothers were learning to code through a program inspired by our mission. My phone rang one afternoon in November. Forbes again. Ms. Lopez, we'd like to feature you on the cover of our January issue. Not about your net worth or your company valuation, about what you're building with the foundation. We're calling it The Quiet Billionaire Who Rewrote Success. Would you be interested? I thought about all the interviews I declined, all the opportunities to tell my story that I turned down because I didn't want to be defined by my family's dysfunction. But this was different. This wasn't about revenge or vindication. This was about showing other women what was possible when you chose yourself, even when it was terrifying. Yes, I said, but I want 3 other women on the cover with me. Foundation recipients who've built successful businesses, and I want to talk about them more than I talk about myself. The Forbes editor paused. That's unconventional. That's the point, they agreed. The Forbes photo shoot happened on a cold December afternoon in our foundation's main space, surrounded by photos of the women we'd helped and quotes from their success stories covering the walls. The photographer had set up near the windows, natural light streaming in. I stood in the centre wearing a simple black blazer and the hand-knitted scarf my mother had made years ago, the one she'd dismissed at that first Christmas dinner. My mother stood on my left, her grey hair styled simply, wearing a dress she'd made herself from one of her old sketches that Aunt Clara had helped her recreate. Her eyes were different now, brighter, less weighed down by regret. Sarah stood on my right, in her typical style, practical and confident, the person who'd believed in me when I'd barely believed in myself. The photographer captured us like that 3 women, 3 generations of struggle and triumph standing together. The headline read, "The Women Who Built Lopez Legacy, a Story of Pain, Patience and Power." The interview happened over coffee in my office. The reporter, a woman in her 40s who admitted she'd been following my story since the Forbes Billionaire List announcement. "What made you strong enough to endure all of that?" she asked. "The lawsuit, the smear campaign, the family betrayal. Where did that strength come from?" I thought about how to answer honestly. I wasn't strong, I was broken. I spent most of my life feeling insufficient, invisible, not enough. But I learned something crucial through all of it. Pain is just a signal that something needs to change. And silence isn't weakness. Silence is patience. Can you explain that? I stayed silent because I was building. When you're building something real, something that matters, you don't need to announce it. You don't need to defend it or explain it or justify it to people who won't understand anyway. You just build. And when it's big enough, when it's undeniable, it speaks for itself. The reporter nodded, taking notes. The world is very loud right now. Everyone posting their achievements, announcing their plans. You did the opposite. The world is loud with people shouting about what they're going to do. I decided to be quiet about what I was doing, and when the time came, when people finally looked, there was no debate about whether I'd succeeded. The work had already answered every question. What would you say to women who are where you were 3 years ago? Overlooked, underestimated, maybe being told they're not enough. I looked directly at her, speaking to every woman who might read this. You are enough. Not because someone finally sees you, not because you prove something to the people who doubted you, but because you see yourself. That's where power begins. Not in external validation, but in internal recognition. The day you stop waiting for permission and start giving it to yourself, that's the day everything changes. And forgiveness, she asked. Your mother is in this photo with you after years of by your own account not seeing you. How did you get there? Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about refusing to let the past define your future. My mother and I are building something new now. It's imperfect and sometimes uncomfortable, but it's honest. And that's worth more than pretending the pain never happened. The magazine hit stands the next morning. My phone immediately exploded with messages from investors, journalists, women who'd read the article and wanted to share their stories. But I didn't check any of it. I was in my apartment sitting at the kitchen table with my mother, both of us holding coffee cups, the December sun streaming through the windows. The magazine sat between us, open to the cover photo. My mother kept looking at it, then at me, then back at the photo. You included me, she said quietly, after everything. You're part of this story, Mum. The painful part, yes, but also the part about breaking cycles, about choosing differently. That matters. She reached across the table and took my hand. Just us. Finally, just us. My mother and I had been cooking since dawn, the kitchen of my childhood home, smelling like cinnamon and ham, and the rosemary bread my grandmother used to make. It was the first Christmas since I'd bought the house back, the first time in years that I'd wanted to host a family gathering. Pass me the flour, my mother said, not looking up from the dough she was kneading. I handed it to her, and our hands brushed. Neither of us pulled away. Sarah arrived first, with Daniel and his wife bringing wine and stories about their kids. Lena came next with homemade desserts, her confidence so different from the nervous woman who'd walked into my office a year ago. Aunt Clara flew in from Mexico City, immediately taking over the living room with her loud laughter and stories about her new sewing collective. By early afternoon, the house was full of people and warmth and the kind of conversation that happens when people genuinely like each other, not just tolerate each other out of obligation. I was checking on the ham when someone knocked on the door. My mother looked at me, a question in her eyes. I shrugged and went to answer it. Peter stood on the porch, and for a moment I didn't recognise him. He'd lost weight, his suit hanging loose on his frame. His beard was scruffy, untrimmed, and his eyes held something I'd never seen before, humility. Amanda, he said. I wasn't sure if I should come. You were invited. He held out a small wrapped package. I brought you something. Inside was a simple notebook, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. He'd written on the first page, list of people I hurt, and what I'm doing to make it right. I flipped through it, pages of names, notes beside each one. When I got to my name, I read teaching financial literacy classes for free at community centres twice a week, helping people I once took advantage of. It's not enough, but it's a start. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I am sorry. I looked up at him. Keep going, Peter. You're not there yet, but you're walking. He nodded, something like relief crossing his face. Can I stay for dinner? Yes. Dinner was different from any family meal I'd ever experienced. My mother moved around the table serving food, and when she got to me, she paused. Then, deliberately, she served my bowl first before anyone else's, even before Peter's. You were always my strongest child, she said softly, just loud enough for me to hear. I was just too scared to admit it. Too scared it meant I failed. I squeezed her hand. You didn't fail, Mum. You survived. And you raised someone who learned from your pain, not just repeated it. That's not failure. That's legacy. She smiled, and for the first time I could remember it reached her eyes. Peter was quiet through most of the meal, listening more than talking. When Aunt Clara asked him what he'd been doing, he told her about the community centre classes, about trying to help people understand credit and debt and financial planning. "It's small," he said. "Nothing like what I used to do, but it feels honest." Sarah caught my eye across the table, raised her glass slightly. I returned the gesture. After dinner, we sat around the living room, Aunt Clara telling stories about our family's history in Mexico, about her mother and grandmother, about generations of women who'd survived and persevered and quietly built lives from nothing. My mother sat beside me on the couch, her shoulder touching mine, both of us listening. Peter sat across the room, separate but present part of the circle, but not dominating it. The candles on the mantel flickered, casting warm light across faces I'd known my whole life, but was only now beginning to really see. This wasn't the family I was born into, the one where love was conditional and success was measured by how much you could diminish someone else to elevate yourself. This was the family we chose to become. Imperfect, healing, real. Morning light streamed through the windows of my home office, warming the space where I'd been sitting for the past hour, coffee growing cold in my cup, just thinking. On my desk sat 2 frames. The first held the Forbes Cover Me, My Mother and Sarah, standing together, 3 women who'd learned that strength isn't about never breaking, it's about what you build after you do. The second frame, smaller, held my father's letter to my mother, the one he'd written, but never sent, the one that had helped me understand that pain passes through generations until someone chooses to stop carrying it. I opened my journal, something I'd started doing after the foundation launched, and began to write. They say success is loud, but mine was quiet, built in silence, brick by brick, while they weren't looking. I didn't need them to see me. I just needed to see myself. When Mum finally saw that Forbes list, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw the daughter she'd overlooked for 30 years, and in her tears I saw something I'd waited my whole life for regret. Not mine, hers. That's not revenge, that's just truth finally arriving. And the truth is this: I didn't win when I made the Forbes list. I won the day I stopped needing to be on it. The day I saw my own worth regardless of who else could see it. That was my quiet victory. Everything else was just the world catching up. The TV in the corner was playing morning news volume low. I glanced up when I heard my name. Amanda Lopez has been named to Time's 100 Most Influential People. Her Lopez Legacy Foundation has now helped 50,000 women worldwide start businesses. When asked about her success, Lopez said simply, "I just wanted to stop being invisible. Turns out I never was. I was just looking for validation in the wrong mirror." I smiled at that quote from last week's interview, at how simple the truth sounded when you finally understood it. The door opened and my mother walked in, carrying 2 coffee cups, steam rising from both. She'd started doing this on Sunday mornings, bringing coffee and sitting with me, while we both woke up slowly, sometimes talking, sometimes just being together in comfortable silence. She handed me a fresh cup and sat in the chair beside my desk. We looked out the window together at the garden, now full of summer flowers, sunlight making everything glow. On the windowsill between us sat a shadow box I'd made. Inside was the hand-knitted scarf from that first Christmas dinner 4 years ago, the one she'd set aside without a second glance. I'd added a small brass plaque beneath it, my first gift, the one she didn't see until she did. My mother noticed me looking at it. "I see it now," she said quietly. "I see all of it now. I know, Mum." We sat there as the morning stretched on the 2 of us in the light, and I thought about how success isn't about making people see you. It's about seeing yourself so clearly that even those who doubted you can't look away. When Mum saw that Forbes list, she finally saw me. But by then, I'd already seen myself. And that was the real victory, the quiet one, the one that lasts. And that's where my story ends, or maybe where it really begins. Because the truth is, This isn't just my story. It's the story of every woman who's been told she's not enough. Every daughter who sacrificed her dreams for someone else's. Every person who spent years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. If you're listening to this and you see yourself in any part of my journey, I want you to know something: you don't need permission to choose yourself. You don't need to wait until you're broken beyond repair to start building something new. And you definitely don't need anyone's approval to know your worth. The quiet victories are the ones that last. The ones built in silence, proven by action, undeniable by the time anyone thinks to question them. So here's my question for you. What would you build if you stopped waiting for permission? What dream have you been carrying in silence, afraid to start, because someone told you it was too late, you're too old, or you're not enough? I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and tell me what you're going to stop apologizing for. Tell me what quiet victory you're working toward. Your story matters and I'm listening. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt seen in any part of it, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I share stories like this every week. Stories about resilience, about breaking cycles, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they finally decide they're worth fighting for. Remember, success isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's about being so undeniably excellent that even silence speaks volumes. Thank you for listening. Now go build something that makes them remember your name.